Thank you for that. So, good morning. It's 10 o'clock, so I shall resume this inquiry regarding Purley Baptist Church. This is day 3. Usual reminders, would everyone please put their name on the attendance list and ensure their mobile devices don't ring while the inquiry is sitting. Now, today's programme is to hear the remaining witnesses for the applicants and the council's witnesses, and ideally deal with the discussions of conditions in the section 106, but we'll have to see how we get on with regard to that. The only other thing I was going to ask is whether we've got anywhere on timings for the site visits.
I don't know. Let me just. Have we started the itinerary running? Right. Work is underway on preparing the itinerary. I think the direct answer to your question is no, but it's in hand.
Okay, right. Well, I'll keep prompting on that one, and
thank you, sir.
Then we can programme next week. Are there any other procedural, administrative, or housekeeping matters?
Well, just to explain, sir, that you raised a number of questions yesterday about various matters, and we're preparing a series of notes to put in to respond to those various points.
Thank you very much.
Some of them, obviously, I will cover with my remaining witnesses, particularly Mr. Pearson in due course. So I should say that I've decided I am going to call Mr. Cunningham of Thornset, and he is going to explain to you various matters concerning viability issues, ownership, structures, and so on and so forth, so that you have a clear picture in relation to those matters.
Thank you very much.
But apart from that, there are no...
So you're going to call him next?
No.
No, right at the end? No, I meant after this witness.
Indeed.
Yes.
If things turn out as I would like them to, after the transport evidence, Mrs. Balboa, I would call Mr. Cunningham and then call Mr. Pearson. But it may be that the last two witnesses are handed. We'll see. Much depends on when the morning break comes.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Anything else? Then please introduce your next witness, and we'll proceed.
Thank you, sir. So we're going to turn to transportation now. So I'll call Mrs. Balboa, and sir, for her evidence, you should have a proof. It has bound in at the back an appendix.
Yes.
I'll introduce the witness, and in the manner in which we've been working to date, we won't read anything out, but I will ask various subjects to be dealt with by the witness in turn. So, if I can introduce the witness, you set out your qualifications and experience on page 5 of your proof. You indicate to us that you're a chartered engineer, registered with the Engineering Council and a chartered member of the Institute of Logistics and Transport, honours degree in civil engineering. You're a member of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, 20 years professional experience in transport planning and engineering, and you indicate in very brief summary the nature of your work as set out here. Are those details correctly summarised there?
Yep, they're correct.
Good.
Yes, I'm about to say that.
Yes.
Can you either speak up or hold the microphone closer to you?
What we don't want you to do is to lean so uncomfortably forward that it's not good for you.
Can I just test this? Hello?
Is it switched on?
That's a very good question, sir.
There's a light on? Yes, that's on.
It should pick you up if you just sit normally.
Hello?
Apparently people can hear you now, so
thank you.
That's grand. Good. So, having introduced you then, and hoping that people can hear you, what I'd like you to do, the first theme I'd like you to summarise your evidence in relation to, please, is the subject of residential parking. You'll know that the Residents' Associations and the MP and various other objectors have raised issues as to whether there's sufficient provision made for parking for the new homes that we propose. So can you just help us with that, please, first of all?
Yes, certainly. So there are 37 parking spaces proposed for the residential development, and that's a ratio of 0.17 spaces per unit. The reason that level of parking is considered to be acceptable is that, first of all, the site has very good access to public transport. That's already been mentioned that it's a PTAL of 5, and also that the site is located within a controlled parking area, and it's been agreed with Croydon Council.
Sublime to the ridiculous there.
That
Hendricks at the Art of White, for those of you who are old enough to remember.
It's been agreed with Croydon Council that residents of the development will not be entitled to permits. So residents of the development will not be able to park on street surrounding the site, and they also have access to the good public transport facilities, and that's why a lower parking provision is proposed.
May I just ask, does your evidence rely on the fact that they won't be entitled to permits?
It does, yes.
I think I'm right in saying I shouldn't ask this witness questions about that, but it's more of a sort of matter to come to when we deal with the 106 and so on.
Yes, I mean, I think the assumption that has been made, you've checked, the witness has factored that into her workings, if you like, and she has. As for whether that is secured properly, then plainly that's a matter for the planning obligation discussion.
I mean, as you know, there are two key court cases, and I'd like you or somebody to take me through those, but I don't think this is the right moment, is it? No. Thank you.
Okay.
So you were on residential parking, sorry, and can you just help in relation to the policy situation? And are there any policies in any of the plan documents that require any higher provision of parking spaces than that which we propose?
No, the proposals for parking are policy compliant. I do make reference to the policy in my proof at paragraph 3.2.8 and also at 3.2.9. At 3.2.9 I mentioned the London Plan policy on parking, and particularly point out that in the table which sets out the parking requirements, it notes that 1 to 2 beds should have less than 1 space per unit, and later on in the notes it says that all developments in areas of good public transport accessibility in all parts of London should aim for significantly less than 1 space per unit.
Significantly less? Significantly
less.
And that's table 6.2?
That's table 6.2 of the London Plan.
So that's the residential parking. When we, in very brief summary obviously, if we could turn next to the parking for the Baptist Centre, the church centre, the facilities and so on, if you could help us with that please next.
So in terms of the parking for the Baptist Centre, the assessment has been focused largely on the congregation that will be coming on a Sunday, which is expected to be of 450 people. In reality, there are probably 3 different categories of visitor to the Baptist Centre. There will be ongoing activities throughout the week, where the centre is expecting things like cubs and fitness and various clubs to be run. Those activities are very unlikely to need more than the 50 space car park that's proposed. And then on a Sunday, once a week on a Sunday morning, there'll be a large congregation of people coming together, which is the 450 people. And that means that the majority of people that drive won't be able to park in the car park. We've done an analysis. The church actually undertook a travel survey to understand how many people drive, and it showed that 57% of the people coming to those services currently drive, which means that of the 450 people, you'd have 257 would be driving.
Can I just interrupt you? Does that, simply carrying on the existing situation, the existing proportion, does that not bring into account any effect of travel plan issues, trying to encourage people to use other modes and so on? Is that just imagining that what people do at the moment carries on into the future?
That's right. We've assumed a static modal split for the people coming, but of course it might be that with the reduced parking facilities that additional people will choose to come by public transport.
Yeah. Okay, carry on.
Just while Mr. Katkowski raised that point, were you involved in anything to do with the travel plan?
Yes, the travel plan, well, draft travel plan.
Let's go on to that later.
Okay.
Thank you, just as long as I know.
Thank you.
Please
Carry on.
Sorry, yeah. So we end up with a result where once a week on a Sunday we have more people driving to the site, potentially more people driving to the site than parking is provided for. There are various car parks within walking distance of the centre. The most obvious one being Purley multi-storey car park, which is located opposite the station, about 350 metres away. That car park is used by commuters and is quite full during the week, but in the evenings and on Sunday it's very little used. We've undertaken 2 surveys on a Sunday which both show that the car park is underutilised. And so what the parking strategy proposes is that during the one period when the centre is expected to, on a weekly basis, when the centre is expected to exceed its parking demand of 50 spaces, is to utilise the underused car park at Purley multi-storey, and also there are others as well. We also surveyed a smaller car park on Russell Hill Road. And I mentioned there were 3 categories. The other category would be the more ad hoc uses for the centre, which would be, for example, weddings or concerts that might be held. If they were held during the day, they would obviously be subject to the same parking controls as existing residents are, or existing visitors are. They wouldn't be able to park on street, and they could choose to either drive and pay for parking, or they could choose to come by public transport. In the evenings, they would be able to park again on street or in the car parks.
So just moving on now to, I wonder if you could just help with issues about the interrelationship of the parking provision that's been made and highway safety matters, please. You'll know that there have been some concerns raised, so if you could just help with that, please.
So there's been some concerns raised in relation to the car parks and highway safety. The car parks have been designed in line with guidance given in Manual for Streets. They've been designed specifically to make sure that vehicles can turn round within the site so they can enter and exit in forward gear. There's no risk of vehicles reversing out onto the highway. And it's also worth mentioning that a car park management plan will be prepared prior to the occupation of the site. That needs to be approved by the London Borough of Croydon, and that will contain commitments within it by the Purley Centre on how the car park will be managed to ensure it's run safely.
Thank you. And if we can move on, please, you'll know that another issue that's been raised by way of objection is a fear that the development would bring increased congestion to a busy part of Purley, if you like, if I can summarise it very briefly. So can you just help with a summary of your views in relation to that, please?
Because we're restricting the number of car parking spaces for the residential development, then obviously the number of cars that will be generated by that element of the development will also be restricted. I mentioned before that it's actually 37 car parking spaces being proposed. Even if all of those 37 spaces were used which were used during the peak periods, it still wouldn't be of sufficient volume to have a noticeable impact on congestion. The Baptist Centre during the Sunday will obviously generate more traffic, but that is during an off-peak period when traffic flows would be expected to be less on the gyratory. There's also been a question raised about pedestrians potentially adding to congestion on the gyratory. I think it's worth pointing out that all of the pedestrian crossings on the gyratory are signal controlled, and pedestrians are allowed to cross at their turn in the cycle of the staging arrangements. And so additional pedestrians travelling around the gyratory don't necessarily result in additional congestion. It simply means that more pedestrians will be crossing at their turn in the gyratory.
Then, if you could just help, please, with provision that's been made in the scheme in relation to TfL, the scheme to improve the gyratory. So can you just help with that, please? The inspector would have seen the piece of the site is marked out to be basically given to TfL. Can you just help us with that, please?
Yeah, so during the discussions with TfL, they indicated to us that they would like to bring forward improvements to the gyratory, and they requested that a strip of land be safeguarded and provided to them as part of those improvements, and that was agreed and has been incorporated into the scheme. They haven't explained exactly what those improvements are, but obviously providing that strip of land will give TfL more flexibility in the scheme that they develop.
Good. Now then, moving on, you'll know that there have been concerns raised about the safety of the proposed access from Russell Hill Road, you recall, and the arguments made as well, why on earth is it on this side of the site, why isn't it on the other side of the site? So can you just help us with the access that is proposed, its safety or otherwise, and what efforts have been made to assess the safety or otherwise of the proposed access?
Yep, so the site accesses on both sites have been subject to an independent Stage 1 safety audit. TfL actually require independent assessors to be used to have gone through their own approval process, and that was undertaken. We used an approved TfL assessor to produce the safety audits. Pedestrian safety was particularly considered as part of the audit. One of the issues raised was pedestrians crossing Russell Hill Road, and the access has been designed to provide a build-out on the north side of Russell Hill Road to ensure that vehicles emerging...
to provide a what on the north side?
A build-out or a curb.
Thank you.
The idea is that vehicles shouldn't drive too close to the edge of the buildings so that they can see pedestrians coming across the footway. So if a vehicle emerges from an access and it's too close to the building, they can't always see pedestrians walking across. So that's been taken into account, and that's been particularly incorporated into the design. There were also concerns raised about vehicles' ability to come out onto Russell Hill Road, particularly when vehicles are queuing at the traffic lights. This wasn't included in the original design for the planning application, but further measures could be considered at detailed design if necessary. For example, keep clear markings could be added on Russell Hill Road if it was considered to be a concern, and that would allow vehicles better access out onto the street. There was also an issue raised on pedestrian safety, actually at the junction of Russell Hill Road with Brighton Road. I've reviewed the accidents that were included in the transport assessment, which were over a 5-year period, and there were 2 pedestrian accidents at that junction during that time. Both of them were as a result of a pedestrian walking into the path of the vehicle rather than waiting for the green man signal. So in my view, there's no evidence that there is a pedestrian safety issue at that junction.
Thank you. I wonder whether next you could move to public transport, please, and if you can just help with that.
There's been some questions raised on the public transport tables, and I've gone back and reviewed them in some more detail. The WIG transport assessment included a table of train services that is described incorrectly.
So can we just pause and take stock? Now, is this the original transport assessment of May 2016?
That's correct.
Document 1.13.
Yep, that's correct.
Thank you. And the table, can you give us a...
Table 3.
Sorry, what was the reference document?
Core document 1.13.
1.13.
So this is the original TA.
Yeah.
And the table number?
Table 3.2.
Table 3.2, yes. Carry on.
It is incorrectly described as services stopping at Purley Station. In fact, it is a table of journey times to various locations, some of which are direct and some of which are not direct.
Some of which you have to change, presumably.
Some of which you have to change. This was corrected and updated in Technical Note 5.
Now, where do we find Technical Note 5?
CD 2.10.
CD 2.10.
2.10.
2.10, right.
Which are those?
Yes. That's in Volume 3. So in that note, which is dated November 2016,
Yeah.
what happened there?
So in table 3.1, a more detailed assessment of the train services that actually stop at Purley are provided, and the number of services per hour are provided, which were correct at the time of the note. There is a detail that isn't included in the note, which is that the trains travelling from London to Purley with the destinations to Caterham and Tattenham Corner are actually combined. They're actually linked together between London and Purley and then split.
So one train comes in and two trains go out. Is that the basic point?
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. So where, for example, where it's described as a total of 12 services, that's actually 12 services but linked. So it's actually 6 trains when they arrive at Purley and 12 as they leave. The purpose of the technical note was to assess the number of passengers that would be using the train service during the peak periods, and none of the information I've just given you changes the conclusion that there'll be an average of 1 or less than 1 person per carriage.
Additional, was it?
In the peak period generated by the development.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyway, have any of the responsible authorities raised any issues, as they would seem somewhat strange, I have to say, had they done so, but have they raised any issues about the impact of a proposed development in a district centre near a railway station and bus services on trains and buses?
No, so TfL would have taken this note and looked at their own data of occupation on the trains, and they concluded that the impact was acceptable.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Now, before we turn lastly to, in the series of headings that you had, to construction management, the Inspector just raised a little while ago whether you had been involved in drawing up the travel plan and so on and so forth. Now, I don't know whether there's anything you just want to say to by way of a few words to introduce that, or to overview it, if you like. I know it wasn't particularly on the list of things that you had lined up to speak about in chief, but as the Inspector's raised it, can you help at the moment? Or?
So the travel plans were provided in draft form, separate travel plans for the residential element and the community centre. Both of those travel plans will need to be reviewed and updated in advance of the site being occupied, and of course once they're prepared they're live documents and have regular reviews and monitoring.
Thank you. And the travel plans...
Do I have those?
You do. I was just going to say, so the residential one is CD 1.14 and the Baptist Centre one is 1.15. Now they're both dated May 2016, so I think from what you've just said they stand as written then, the idea being, as I understand it, that they're reviewed, should permission be granted, they're reviewed before one actually has the site occupied.
Yeah, so the idea of a travel plan is that it's under a regular review so that it can be adjusted to pick up any areas of concern or any areas that could be further exploited to encourage sustainable travel. So this is the first draft and it will be updated over time.
Thank you. And then finally, in the list of topics for evidence in chief, these are just very brief overviews, obviously. Could you just help us, please, with construction management of the site during construction and the implications for matters within your remit, please, of the construction process?
Yep, so a draft construction logistics plan was prepared for the planning application. Again, this will need to be updated prior to construction. It will be updated in accordance with TfL's latest guidelines, and the contractor will set out in it how he intends to manage the site, particularly in terms of vehicles travelling to and from each of the sites. That is going to be secured by condition, so that will be a requirement to be done and approved before the site can be started. TfL have a series of issues that they expect to be considered and agreed as part of the construction logistics plan, and it's likely that TfL will require construction traffic to travel outside of the network peaks to this development. It's one of the standard things they ask for.
And so before you ask me, you do have that draft, and it's core document 1.16.
Thank you.
Anything else you want to say by way of evidence in chief? Obviously the detail is in your proof, and greater detail is in the transport assessment and various technical notes which are before the inquiry. Anything else you want to say in chief?
No.
Great. Remain there. There would be probably quite a few questions I think we're anticipating from Mr. King.
Yeah.
Mr. King.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, when the name was said, the microphone wasn't working. Could we have your first name, please?
My first name?
Yeah.
Victoria.
Victoria, thank you. And one point of clarification within that. You talked about a build-out in Russell Hill Road. I wasn't quite sure which side of the road it was. You said it was to give a better view of pedestrians from vehicles. So is it what I'd call the south side of Russell Hill Road or the north side of Russell Hill Road?
It's on the north side. I actually have a diagram. If you just give me a... So in my proof of evidence, if you have a look at figure 5.2, page 26, there's a diagram explaining the point on pedestrian visibility.
So those build-outs would be on both sides, is that right? That is the hatched areas, is that it?
That looks as though it's in the exit to Russell Hill.
Is it just... Okay.
Why don't we do it one at a time? So if you turn to the inspector's questions first of all, then...
Yeah. No, I see. On the south side, you've just got on the right-hand side, just the radius, and the build-outs on the left-hand side.
Yes, that's right. As the vehicle's coming out of the access, it will be on the left-hand side of the road,
yeah.
And so visibility for pedestrians coming from the south will be unobstructed. Whereas pedestrians coming from the north, if the vehicle was allowed to drive too close to the building, you could potentially obstruct the visibility of a pedestrian. And that the build-out pushes the vehicle away from the building and makes sure that they can see pedestrians.
I think I understand it now. It's actually in the exit to Russell Hill on the left-hand side.
Yes.
But I got the impression it was actually in Russell Hill Road when you actually spoke.
No, sorry if I was confusing.
No, that's okay. Right, can I just start with a couple of clarifications? I think we accept that it has a very high PTL of 5. I think we accept the number of additional passengers on the bus network and the rail network is fine. They will cater for it. I think in the original transport assessment they actually perhaps underrated the bus network a bit because they only talked about the bus stops here in Russell Hill Road and Banstead Road. In fact, if I was going to Croydon and I hadn't got a modern app and knew the time of the 4:05, I'd probably walk to the Brighton Road where there are something like 17 buses now to Croydon. So I'm quite happy with that. Just on the table and the revised table, I think it is still wrong. Where you say that Caterham and Tatton Corner trains join together at Purley to go to London and separate on the way back. That's correct in the peak hour, but not in the off-peak. So it's only the peak. And
so just to confirm, this assessment is only for the peaks.
Right. Okay. And it's just in the original assessment you talked about, trains to Brixton, Brighton and all the rest of it. And even if you say that it was the journey time rather than the frequency that was important, there are still a number of mistakes in the opportunities to get to, say, Vauxhall, where you would have to change at Clapham Junction, and only 2 trains an hour go from Clapham Junction. It's probably 3 within the peak go to Clapham Junction to change, not 7. But I think the overall issue that there are roughly 10 trains an hour to London of one form or another in the peak and the off-peak is correct. It's just the analysis of where they go that's really wrong. So it's just correcting that. I don't think it's a material issue, but it's just important that it's correct.
Yeah, the table included in the transport assessment is certainly misleading.
Yeah.
But it was corrected in Technical Note 5.
Okay. Then I come on to some of my questions. I start with the A23 is probably the busiest road in Croydon, and there have been a number of studies, both by Croydon and TfL, to look at trying to improve the flow of traffic in the A23. Would you agree there have been a number of studies?
I am aware that there have been various studies, yes.
And those studies always highlight 2 junctions in particular, and sometimes a third one as being the real problems, and those 2 junctions are 5 ways in Purley Way and Purley Gyratory, and occasionally they mention Lombard Roundabout. Is that what they did mention?
I believe so, yes. Yeah. It's something that TfL are studying, but they haven't, as far as I'm aware, they haven't published any actual proposals for Purley Gyratory. But it has been raised as...
No, I agree with you, there's no published resolution, but there have been so many studies, and I've got one for Croydon Council by PBA that says something needs to be done at Purley, and it needs to be done urgently. And it says also the difficulty is if you do something 5 ways, it can have a detrimental effect on Purley Gyratory and vice versa. But it's just to establish that. In the assessment, it talks about cars exiting from the site during the day and the peak hours. It gives you the numbers. But it says, on an average, there's only likely to be 5 cars as a maximum at any one particular time. And I don't disagree with that. But as the sequence of the traffic lights at Russell Hill, Brighton Road, is probably 30 seconds to 35 on red and about 30 seconds on green, would you also agree that, on an average, any particular time of the day, the exit will be blocked because it's only 6 car lengths from the traffic lights, and it's a very busy road, so at any time you can go out there and the exit will be covered by traffic passing. How long do you think it would take for those 5 cars to get out?
I would agree that there would certainly be times when vehicles are trying to come out onto Russell Hill Road when the queue will extend past. Obviously, it depends on exactly when the vehicle comes out in the cycle of the lights, but there would certainly be times when that could happen. As I mentioned earlier, that could actually be addressed simply by putting some keep clear markings outside the entrance on Russell Hill Road, if that was a concern.
Well, I will come back to it later, but TfL have said that that's the one thing they won't have in a letter that's in your transport assessment, but I will quote it a bit later.
Okay.
So
it would be TfL's decision on whether or not that was appropriate.
But I've looked at many times, and there are some times where it's clear, but most times there are at least 6 cars, or 2 HGVs will cover the entrance, 1 HGV and 3 cars will exceed the entrance. So I would think that it's probably, if there were 5 cars, it would take 3 or 4 minutes before they could all get out at least. But when an event happens and there are 50 cars all trying to leave at the same time, how long do you think that will take to get out into Russell Hill Road.
So first of all, going back to the first point you made, I don't agree that it would take 3 or 4 minutes for a vehicle to come out. I haven't actually measured the cycle of the lights, but if you're correct in saying that you basically stop for 30 seconds and then you get green for 30 seconds, during the 30 seconds of green, the vehicles will clear and you'll then be able to turn out. So I don't agree that it'll take 3 or 4 minutes for a vehicle to turn out onto Russell Hill Road.
Well, I would contend that you will only get out if there isn't another vehicle in Russell Hill Road, or another vehicle in Russell Hill Road would allow you to come out.
Well, yes. I mean, you're obviously, as in all priority junctions, you have to wait for a gap in the traffic. But the point that you're making is that the vehicles will queue, and during those times, the vehicle may not be able to turn right out.
Yeah.
But that's only the case when the vehicles have been stacking and the lights are red. 30 seconds later, the lights will change to green and the vehicle will be able to pull out.
But if you went out there, particularly in high peak, the queue of traffic coming down into the A23 is halfway up to Edge Hill, almost 3/4 of a mile away. So it's continuous traffic. The other issue, one of the problems with the Purley gyratory is traffic coming down the Purley Way and out of Pamphus Road generally wants to cross from the near side to the middle and the outside, and traffic coming from Foxley Lane usually wants to cross from the outside to the middle and the inside, which is a cause of some of the problems of congestion there. And traffic coming out of the new exit will be mixed, won't it? Some will want the near side to go the A23, but a lot will want to cross to the middle and the other side.
Well, they don't need to cross directly outside the access. They can cross later on, can't they? They don't need to cross at that exact moment they come out.
If they need to cross, they either need, preferably in the inside lane, which may be difficult, I agree with you, but they certainly need to be in the middle lane, because if you got trapped in the outside lane, you'll end up being taken with the flow round to the A23. So you've either got to cross there or try and immediately cross as you cross the lights, which is a very difficult manoeuvre.
So as you turn right, you enter into 3 lanes of traffic.
Yeah.
All 3 lanes of traffic go straight ahead.
Yes.
And then you have an opportunity to go into either the middle lane or stay, as you say, in the right-hand lane, depending on which direction you want to travel in.
Well, the way the junction is lined, I would contend that if you're in the outside lane, the right-hand lane, you are more or less forced to turn to the Purley, round to the A23, or you've got to try and get across 1 or 2 lanes by nudging people out the way. It's the
nature of a gyratory that you need to move into different lanes as you turn around the gyratory. That is the nature of a gyratory.
But my point on that would be, if you come from Foxley Lane and want to do that, you have got the whole length of Russell Hill to do it in. If you come out this exit, you've only got 6 car lengths before the traffic lights, or about 6 car lengths after the traffic lights, where the traffic is then starting to flow quite fast. So I'm just concerned about that. In the traffic assessment, it did...
Do you want to let her respond to that?
Oh, sorry, I was just...
Well, I can only repeat what I've said. The accesses have been reviewed by TfL and by Croydon. They've been considered acceptable. There are opportunities to change lanes. If you do want to get into the middle lane, the lanes are actually quite narrow outside of Russell Hill Road, so I wouldn't have thought it would be particularly difficult if the road was, if there was a gap to get into the second lane. And if you don't get into the second lane before the lights, then there's an opportunity to move into the second lane after the stop line.
Yeah, I just contend that that's harder than you say. And also the sweeps in the transport assessment showed a fair number of cars having to get across the lanes there. But I'll leave it there. I think I've made my point on that. But you didn't come back and say how long it would take 50 cars exiting at the same time, how long you thought that would take for them to get out.
Well, I haven't done that analysis, but I wouldn't envisage all 50 cars trying to leave the car park at exactly the same time. There obviously will be a larger number of people leaving on the Sunday, but again, it's a Sunday and the traffic flows will be lighter, so it'd be easier to get out. But I haven't done an analysis on likely delay times.
I would contend that traffic is lighter on a Sunday, but the junction is just as crowded on a Sunday. But my point is that people coming to an event will arrive at slightly different times because it's not coordinated other than they have to be there by a time. But when an event finishes, I mean, some people may hang around to do other things, but the majority of those people will try and leave at the same time. And I think that's important that somebody has an idea how long that will take.
I think I would respond by asking whether or not, in my opinion, a queue within the development waiting to come out onto Russell Hill Road doesn't do any harm to the road network or to pedestrians. If there was a queue, if lots of people did suddenly all try and come out at the same time, they're queuing within the development, they're not creating any safety issues on the road network, and they will come out in the time that it takes them to come out.
Okay. And my next bit is, because to give you I think we're of the view that Banstead Road would have been a better exit. In Banstead Road, the flow of traffic is after the lights. So, and there is also a pedestrian set of lights in Banstead Road. So our contention is that if the exit was in Banstead Road, because the traffic would be stopped once or twice, it would be far easier to find gaps in the traffic to exit.
It would have been possible to put an access onto Banstead Road. That isn't part of the proposals. Early on in the design of the scheme, there was an option to have an exit onto Banstead Road, and it had an impact on the pedestrian crossing that's there. It required the pedestrian crossing to be moved, and there was not a resolution to that. You either had to move the pedestrian crossing closer to the gyratory, which would potentially create congestion or queuing on the gyratory, or you had to move the pedestrian crossing further along Banstead Road, which would take it even further off the pedestrian desire line. The two highway authorities, Croydon and TfL, didn't agree on which would be the most appropriate solution. Of course, neither were ideal, and the access was moved onto the other side of the road. I'm not saying it couldn't have been overcome. It potentially would have been possible to have an access onto Banstead Road, but it's not something that's being proposed as part of the scheme.
Well, my point on that is I accept everything you say, and TfL's letter confirms that the issue in Banstead Road was moving a pedestrian crossing, but the exit didn't have to actually be by the pedestrian crossing. That was the access that was produced.
I think, Mr. King, as Mr. Katkowski's already kindly reminded me, I can only consider the scheme that's before me.
Right.
And anything else really is going off at a tangent. I hope the earlier explanation was helpful, but I think we need to move on.
I think Victoria did agree that if there was an exit onto Banstead Road, the traffic access would be easier.
I made a note.
I don't think I said that. I said it would most likely have been possible to put an access onto Banstead Road and to resolve the pedestrian crossing issue.
Can I ask the question again? If there was an exit onto Banstead Road, ignoring whether we move pedestrian crossing...
Forgive me, the inspector's already indicated, if I might say quite rightly, that...
Shall we move on?
Right. He's to consider the scheme before the inquiry.
Right, OK. In your evidence, you talked about 2 pedestrian accidents.
Yes.
But in your assessment of Purley Gyratory as a whole, that you actually list 41 accidents in a 5-year period.
In the transport assessment, that's correct.
Yeah. And of them, actually 30/31, because it talks about Russell Hill Road, Brighton Road, were actually in Russell Hill.
I counted 17 on the junction of Russell Hill Road and Brighton Road.
Yeah, well, I took the length of Russell Hill from Pampersford Road Purley Way junction to there, and I think you'll find it was 30. I did a different analysis, but the same, but just took a different period. I took a later period, and I came up with 27 in the whole gyratory, of which 11 were in Russell Hill Road between Pampersford Road and the Brighton Road. And the majority of those are minor collisions with people trying to change lanes, I assume, and somebody not giving way. There were 2 serious in the whole incident, but only 2. But it just shows you that that is a difficult stretch of road to negotiate with people coming from the left trying to get to the right and coming from the right trying to get to the left.
Well, those accidents, I assume your accident statistics are also over a 5-year period.
Yes.
Those accidents are over a 5-year period. To be honest with you, with the volume of traffic that's travelling through the gyratory, I actually don't think that's a particularly high accident rate. I don't think it does show a particular accident issue on the gyratory.
Well, I think we may differ on that, but it just shows you that there are a number of accidents and they are concentrated in Russell Hill rather than the rest of the gyratory. The other point on the accident, on your assessment there was 1 at the junction of Banstead Road and Brighton Road, and on my assessment there were none in Banstead Road. And that's, I believe, because the traffic is flowing better in Banstead Road because it's flowing away from the junction rather than to the junction. I don't know if you had a comment on that flowing away is better than...
I would imagine the reason that there are fewer accidents on Banstead Road is because there's not a junction on Banstead Road. There's only the pedestrian crossing. Most accidents occur at junctions where vehicles are obviously crossing. I think it's worth pointing out that regardless of where the access would go, vehicles that are travelling to and from the site would obviously have to travel around the gyratory in its entirety, whether that be on the arrival or the departure of the journey. So it doesn't actually matter where the access is. Vehicles, say vehicles were coming from the south, they would still need to travel through Russell Hill Road and through that junction at some point in their journey.
As a fairly local resident, I would just contend that if it was in Banstead Road, some residents coming from the south and the west would actually be able to come in from Banstead Road and leave via Banstead Road and Foxley Lane rather than have to go around the gyratory.
Okay, that is possible that route could go, yeah.
Just to finish on that before I go, I'm quoting from, it's in your transport assessment, it's a letter to Victoria Balboa from Alex Williams of TfL, and it was after a meeting, on-site meeting, and I'll just quote the paragraph on page 4, which is the second paragraph. It's, although the benefits of removing the barrier, because previously they talked about having a barrier to control entrance and exit, it is understood that there is concern that reversing access road vehicles exiting onto Russell Hill, close proximity of a signal junction, rather than the less congested Banstead Road. In particular, vehicles wishing to leave the site and use the A22 southbound may need to wait across the near side lane for a gap in the traffic. To this end, also to ensure that signals work as efficiently as possible, the applicant should understand that TfL would not be willing to introduce keep clear markings across the exit from the site in Russell Hill Road. So that was TfL's comment on those.
So I offered keep clear markings as a potential solution to be considered at detailed design. Obviously, if TfL maintained that view, then they would not want to put the keep clear markings in, but they have accepted the junction in its form without keep clear markings.
Yeah, I accept that, but they also say that Banstead Road would have been easier. The other issue I want to raise is about air quality. Okay. We've been told from the architects that they will mitigate air quality at ground level with filters and things of that nature. But
I don't think that was right, was it? I think the filters were for the upper floors.
Upper floor,
right?
yeah. But
Continue with the question.
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, neither of you are right. But
right.
but carry on.
Right. But somewhere within the site, they will have to do some filtering because they accept air quality on a busy junction like that, and the additional cars on site may cause some air quality problems. My concern is that cars queuing out to get onto the exit will also be idling. So the studies that both Lambeth and Dudley councils have done say that idling cars cause about twice as much pollutants from exhaust than cars in transit. And my concern is those cars queuing to get out will actually increase both the pollution in Russell Hill and on site, and particularly when 50 cars try to exit at the same time.
I can't comment on air quality issues. It's not my area, I'm afraid. But obviously that would have been, the site has been assessed in terms of air quality.
Well, Croydon Council in their 106 have come back with an answer saying that they will introduce...
I'll just interrupt you because obviously the witness, forgive me, I'm not trying to be rude, but the witness has explained that it's not her bag, if you like. What we are going to have, as you know, so we've responded in writing to the various air quality issues, but you'll know that Croydon has put a witness statement in on this very subject, and Mr King is right. Within the 106, the council has requested and has been added to the 106, in effect, an anti-idling strategy and so on and so forth. And we'll come to that in due course. But all I'm saying at the moment is this is not the witness to ask those questions.
Indeed, but it's relevant insofar as the air quality evidence will have made certain assumptions based on the traffic evidence. So it's quite right that this witness be asked about the traffic evidence, just so that we're clear what her assumptions were, and then they can be measured against the air quality assumptions. So,
well, her assumptions are exactly as they're documented, so the traffic,
indeed,
all the numbers are there.
I think there's a degree of repetition in terms of the queuing, but it's quite right that Mr King should ask about that queuing and be very clear about the answers.
I have no difficulty at all with Mr King asking.
It should stop there.
Asking about the queuing, which he's already done.
Yes. Yeah, and then when he's got those answers, he can.
Which he has.
Yeah. I think he has. But,
well,
let's confirm that. Then he can take the answers to the air quality witness.
Exactly. So all I'm trying to say is, of course, Mr King should ask any questions he wants to ask about the numbers of vehicles and queues or otherwise, etc., so the nuts and bolts, if you like, of the transport assessment. But as the witness has explained, the consequences for air quality of those numbers is not a matter for her. That's the only point I'm making.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I add
Mr. King.
The last two words of my question that I did was that I understand the council is going to introduce idling patrols, which I'd be interested to see how that works. But that's that. The issue you raised...
Well, do you want the witness to comment on that or not?
I don't think I'm not sure this
do you know anything about idling? Have you come across these?
No, I don't feel qualified to answer that question.
That's fine.
I think it is just sort of worth sort of revisiting these numbers and keeping it in context, though. I wouldn't like the time that it takes to turn out of the junction to be exaggerated. We've got a car park with 50 cars parked in it. We don't know exactly how people will leave after a service, but normally we would assess it over a period of an hour. Even if it was over the period of half an hour, you'd have vehicles coming out, one a minute, one every 30 seconds. We've already discussed that the lights change every minute, and the cycle of the lights gives a 30-second green time. I can't see that there would be a significant number of vehicles idling or queuing unless everybody decided to leave the car park at exactly the same time. And even if they did, of course, they wouldn't get out at the same time. They'd be walking to their car. They'd be taking different amounts of time to get in the car, reverse out and come out onto the road.
Yeah. But I just base it on experience at other places where you go to events like theatres. The majority of people try to leave at the same time, and that's when you get the major queuing issue. If you go and have a cup of tea or go and talk to somebody for 20 minutes after, it's easier, but that immediate, I think the majority of people will try and exit at the same time, which is my point. Could I just move on to parking? Parking, you say it correctly, it's in a controlled zone, parking zone, but that controlled parking zone is only for 1 hour of the day at midday. So people who come into events in the afternoon, evening, will be able to park in the controlled parking zone. The people who live on site, if they have a car and haven't got a parking space, will also be able to park in a controlled parking zone overnight. Now, we have had this situation in a couple of other places in the borough where new developments are taking place where the number of car spaces are considerably less than the number of dwellings, and one in particular is Causden, which is only 1.5 miles away, where this has caused what I call parking rage, where the police have had to be called on a number of times because people who already live there have paid £120 for a parking permit, come home from work and then find they can't park anywhere near their house because somebody from the new development has parked there, even though they're not allowed a parking permit. And I just wonder if these lessons from other places in the borough have been taken into consideration.
So just to clarify, you aren't referring to the residents because the controlled parking zone runs across the day. Are you referring to the pay and display?
No, I'm talking
bays?
to the controlled parking zone that's in and around Purley.
So the controlled parking zone is active from. I'm just trying to find my.
Well, there's two sections to it.
Just give her a moment. Find
So the controlled parking zone is active Monday to Saturday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So you need a permit to park.
Or you
during
pay
those times, or
you pay,
or you pay, you park in a time limited pay and display bay.
But there is a further extension of that where there is a 1 hour parking, and it applies in a number of places, particularly around stations, to stop people parking there all day. And you still need a parking permit if you want to park there yourself. Yeah. But if you're from another resident, you can park there after, I think it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah. So
and overnight.
So just to clarify, then your question then isn't related to residents; it's related to visitors because
no,
the visitors.
It's the residents because what they will do, those controlled parking zones, even the one where you pay the meter, you don't pay after 6 in the evening. Yeah. So they can park there overnight. Yes. Whereas
yes, it would be possible for residents without a permit to park overnight after 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And also on Sundays, but they can't park during the weekday, and they can't park on Saturdays without a permit.
Or paying at a meter.
Or paying.
Yeah. No, I understand that, but there is another part of the controlled parking zone that is only valid for 1 hour.
Okay.
Which is slightly nearer the station, but also within walking distance of the.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly where that area is.
It's nearer the station.
But I think the fact remains that residents wouldn't be able to park. They wouldn't be able to leave their car during the day on the street without a permit. So if they had a car.
Yeah. No, I do understand that.
And left for the day, they would get a ticket.
Yeah. Yeah. The point I would make is in the other areas, it's usually after 5 o'clock that the problem starts.
So we did a parking survey after 5 o'clock, and the analysis is in the transport assessment, and it did show that there were spare spaces after 5 o'clock. It showed that there was space for additional vehicles to park.
Yeah, but there may not be sufficient additional spaces for those that come with cars.
Well, we have done that analysis in the transport assessment, and our conclusion was that there was sufficient space.
Yeah. I think the difference between us is our experience is that even when you build developments like this, where you assume and hope people won't have cars, sometimes they start without a car, then they get one, or they do actually come with a car, and that's our experience elsewhere. You know, we understand the aims and we support them, but the practice is not quite as it would seem.
So I do address this in some detail in my evidence, and it is also in the transport assessment. It would be possible to park a car overnight after 5 o'clock, and it would be possible to park on a Sunday, but importantly it wouldn't be possible to park on the Saturday. So it would be very difficult. It's possible for someone, a resident, to have a car and park on street, but it would be quite difficult for them.
Okay. My last point is about pedestrian flow, and I'm quite happy with what you said about the controlled lights and crossings, although for a pedestrian it is rather difficult to cross. You have to cross many times sometimes. But my contention is that Russell Hill Road, with the shops and businesses and the local pub, that pavement is much busier than the pavement outside Banstead Road, except when there is, like Sundays, an event in Banstead Road. And with the exit onto Russell Hill Road, it will affect more pedestrians than if there was an exit onto Banstead Road.
I can only reiterate the information that I've given already, which is that we've designed an access which has been safety audited, it's been accepted by TfL, it's been accepted by the London Borough of Croydon. There is nothing wrong with the access that's being proposed.
Yeah, and I accept from a safety point of view you're correct. I'm just saying it will interfere with more pedestrians than it would have if it was in Banstead Road. And I think the other positive point I would make is that we're pleased that somebody, as a result of this, would straighten the corner on the junction of Russell Hill, Brighton Road, because offset is where, if there's a big HGV, you actually reduce it from 3 lanes to 2 lanes because of the offset nature and their turning circle. So that is a positive aspect of the scheme.
Yes, I think it would be a good benefit.
Yeah. I don't know if any of my colleagues wish to raise it.
Hi, thank you. You say in 5.2.3, I understand we're going to discuss the controlled restriction of POET systems under section 106.
Sorry, is this my evidence?
Yeah, sorry.
Could you say those reference again?
5.2.3, page 22.
Yep.
You say that the residents will not be able to park on street during the day, but they can go on street overnight when parking is not restricted, and apparently there's sufficient capacity to do so. This is one of the major concerns that residents of Purley have raised, because, as Charlie referred to, that if they're coming back later, they won't be able to park. I think there is an issue. There will be a lot more cars on our roads. And you do refer to the car parks in Purley, or particularly the leisure car park. But in the emerging plan, 11.124, table 1113, the Purley Leisure Centre is could have proposed development including car park, new leisure facilities, swimming pool, and other community facilities, or residential accommodation. And as we know, if we have residential accommodation with a high PTAL rating, car parking will just be reduced. And the other car park at the back lanes, again, that's available for development with still some form of car park use, but with no idea of how many numbers. So, and that's what you're reliant on for the community space particularly, to be able to use for parking. But it concerns me that these car parking spaces will not be available.
Okay, so if I take your first point, which was that residents may park overnight on street, I think that a resident would have to be very determined and very organised if they wanted to own a car without having a parking space on the site. They would need to move their car around across the day, paying for pay and display bays. They would need to find somewhere to put their car on a Saturday, and then obviously they could leave it overnight, and they'd have to get up before 9 and move it. So while yes, it is physically possible that you could own a car and not have a parking space, it seems extremely unlikely that someone would go to such a level of effort. Perhaps they would buy a flat somewhere else that did have a parking space if they were so determined to own a car. We have done surveys of the parking capacity at 5 o'clock in the evening, and it did show there were spare spaces. So if we did come across such a determined person, then there are spaces for them to park on street. Moving on to your other point about the multi-storey car park, car parking, we don't know whether that will be redeveloped, and if it is redeveloped, that will be for Croydon to decide. Car parking is listed as one of the things it will be redeveloped into, so I'm not aware there's any suggestion that car parking would be removed. And of course Croydon would have to do their own analysis as to what the capacity of the new car park would be. I've seen it during the day. It's used for commuter parking during the day, and I would suggest that they are likely to re-provide a large car park.
I admire your optimism, but from what we've discovered, that doesn't happen. I mean, in Lyme Green Road car park in Causton is a classic example. But I don't think we can assume that they will supply the same number of car parking spaces.
I don't think it's fair to assume that they won't.
Well, I think it's fair to assume that, but okay. The other thing is that we do have many roads around here which do not have parking restrictions. And not that far from the site. So this parking at 5 o'clock, I mean, the chances are presumably they would all be coming home at the same time. But if residents come home at 5, then other residents cannot park. And this is something that has happened elsewhere, where people cannot park. After the restrictions finish on various roads, they park there, and where people have got permits, they can't park there anymore. But I think Charlie covered that point. And also, the other point I'd like to make, that have you taken into account possible increased use of the community centre? There's a lot of discussion about the auditorium, the church being used on a Sunday, but if it's available to the wider community, I appreciate you did address that during the week they may have to come by public transport, or they're going to be using up the car parks in Purley. And I do think this is an area of concern, because it's, if the facility will be used more and more, I mean, obviously the numbers you have done have been based on a Sunday service.
So if we take the 57% of people arriving here by car as a static percentage, then you could have 88 people in the centre filling the 50 car parking spaces on site. There are a number of activities that the church would like to be able to run with the new facility, but I'm not aware that any of them that are run on a regular basis will exceed that number. So there could be sports gym, fitness classes held here, there could be Cubs, Scouts and things like that. I'm not aware that any of those would generate more than 88 people and therefore would fill the car park. Those sorts of services that are provided, of course, are also often attractive to people that live locally, and so that 57% is probably an overestimate of how many people would actually drive to those sorts of facilities. And I have already mentioned, yes, there could be some ad hoc events that were held that had more than 88 people, and the parking options are obviously to pay during the day or to come by public transport.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Dennis.
Are we speaking?
No,
Thank you. Did you come by train today?
I did. Of course.
I regularly cross Purley Way at Edge Hill.
Okay.
It is always on 9 o'clock in the morning. The traffic is 9 times out of 10 stacked right back to there. So we know we have a really big problem already at this point on the Purley Cross. So that any further traffic entering is going to increase that queue down on Purley Way. I mean, that's factual. It has to be.
The amount of traffic that this development will generate, because we have restrained parking, is minimal compared to the amount of traffic that's already using Purley Way and is on the gyratory. Mr. Burton actually provides some numbers in his evidence on this, which if I can just get my reference for you. So if you go to Mr. Burton's proof of evidence at paragraph 4.30, he's taken the annual average daily traffic flow from the Department for Transport website and done an analysis of the daily traffic that will result from the residential development. And his conclusion is that the vehicles represent less than 0.5% of the traffic that's already on the road. It's such a small percentage, it really isn't going to have a noticeable impact on the congestion of the roads. And that's down to constraining the parking.
Right, okay. Now, I've parked my car here, and I parked here yesterday. When I left, I drove straight out onto Banstead Road. I know you don't want to hear that, but it is. I drove straight out, so that illustrates how easy it is to exit onto Banstead Road. But I then had to travel right round the circuit, and we were kept here until about 5:30 last night, and it was like being in a Grand Prix. It was frightening to try and get over to the far lane on the other road going back down south, Russell Hill.
Mr. King, was that while the traffic lights were out?
It made it worse.
I was asking this, Mr. King.
I was so battling with the other traffic, it was difficult to see what was going on.
Okay, I was just checking at what point you were crossing.
Some of the lights were out. I don't know if they were all out yesterday. And there's a pedestrian trying to cross yesterday at lunchtime. That was pretty. So we do already have a very difficult area here at Purley Cross. I just have to highlight that. My other colleagues have said, but I'm reinforcing that point. I wouldn't wish to be regularly using Purley Cross. Thank you.
Right, any more questions from the Residents' Association?
Could I just clarify?
Thank you very much.
Victoria has said that the amount of traffic generated would be less than 0.5%. I think we accept that. Our issue is where the traffic enters the congestion, not the volume. I think just to agree with your analysis of 0.5%. It'd probably even be less as traffic goes up.
Yes.
Is there anyone else who's making a statement objecting to the proposal that wants to ask a question? Okay, well, I've just a few questions. Well, I had a lot, but I think most of them have almost certainly been answered. So I'll look through these now. There's a partial review, Croydon Local Plan Strategic Policies. Do you know when that, September 2016, do you know when that report is due? Is that a transport report, or is that the general one?
Can you just repeat that? Sorry.
London Borough of Croydon Local Plan Strategic Policies, partial review, CLP 1.1, September 2016.
Yes. That's going through, as I understand it, so I would have thought this really...
It's not just a transport one, is it?
No. This is the CLP1, as we call it, has had a part review, and it's followed exactly the same timescales, as I understand it, as CLP2.
Yeah. That's great.
It's not just transport, it's...
A question that's got out of sync, I'm afraid.
Excellent.
Will you be on the site visit next week?
Well, you will now be.
Well, not necessarily, because it may be that that you can get someone else to point out what's necessary. But it would help me if you point out, or somebody points out the exact access proposals, has your drawing with them on site.
I'm sure we can arrange that.
Details.
Best if you're there. It's likely to be Wednesday morning.
Okay. What are the cycling routes in the vicinity? And is there any need for improvements to those?
So the cycling issues are covered in the transport assessment. I'll just refresh my...
You'll have to forgive me, I haven't read every word of every document.
That's completely...
In truth, I don't plan to. But I want to cover all the issues.
With you on that, so it's core document 1.13 is a TA.
So the cycle routes are shown in figure 3.2.
Right.
And there are cycle routes very close to the site, regional cycle routes 23, 29 and 75. There haven't been any...
23,
29 and 75. You can see them on the figure 3.2.
Splendid. Could you bring that drawing with you, please,
yes.
as well, and point those out to me on Wednesday? That would be very helpful. My understanding, we haven't got to the legal document yet, but my understanding is there would be a car club.
That's right.
For the 220 flats.
That's correct.
Is that correct? And there would be one space allocated for it.
Yes, that's correct.
How many residents do you anticipate would be interested in the car club?
I couldn't give you any statistics. I just need to check. We usually speak to a car club operator.
Right.
And I just need to check whether the report was included. Yes, it is. In Appendix I
to the TA
of the transport assessment, there is a report that was prepared by Zipcar.
Right.
So when we're looking at a scheme like this, we contact the operator and ask them how many, what capacity would be required, how many spaces would be needed for a development of this scale. And they provide their advice to us, and their conclusion in the report was that one space would be sufficient for the residents, and that's why the one space is provided.
Okay, so there's not going to be a huge take-up of the car club?
No, but it's going to be provided on street, so it won't be available just to the residents. To the new residents, any existing residents will also be able to use it. And of course, because...
So spread even more thinly?
Well, that's the assessment that Zipcar undertook.
Right.
Obviously, if the demand, if there'd been a higher demand, we would have provided additional spaces.
Okay, I'll thank you for that reference. I'll look that out. That's covered. That's dealt with. What difference in rates do you usually come across in terms of car ownership between residents of market housing and affordable housing?
Generally, when we look at census data, affordable social housing, as it's listed in the census data, has a lower car ownership. That's generally. In the assessment that we've done, in this transport assessment, we haven't attempted to split the market or the affordable. We've taken an average of car ownership.
Right, and what's the average for car ownership?
And just check. So in the transport assessment table 5.1, we've provided. Oh no, sorry, that's not correct. So it's in table 6.1.
6.1. Okay.
Yeah. We've provided a breakdown of the car ownership by census for the Croydon ward, and it's 0.75 is the average number of cars per household.
So have you worked on ownership for the existing rather than the proposed development? Or is that an average for new households?
No, so that is the existing car ownership for this ward from the 2011 census. We obviously wouldn't expect our development to have such a high car ownership.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Okay. Come on to that one later. You refer at your 598 to the use of a mirror for exiting.
Yes, this is something that was raised in the safety audit. It's not something that is part of our proposals, but the safety audit did suggest that a mirror could be used, but to see pedestrians, but we've obviously provided the build out.
Right. So what you're saying is
the mirror shouldn't be necessary.
The build out sort of supersedes it, not necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Now your appendix shows the turning circle, or not a circle. It's a
swept path.
Swept path, yeah, the 3-point turn. To my mind, the vehicle's coming mighty close to the building. Is that right?
Yes, it's reasonably close. The building would probably be, when we come to detailed design, the building would probably be protected in some way, perhaps with a curb or a bollard.
Right. If there's a curb or bollard, there's going to be even less space, isn't there?
Well, there's sufficient space for the vehicle to turn. I think the only area that you might want to consider would be to make sure that the vehicle didn't accidentally reverse too far.
Okay.
This is obviously a swept path showing the vehicle undertaking the manoeuvre in one movement as well.
Right.
It's coming straight in, reversing straight back, and going straight out.
There's not a lot of room for additional turns, though, is there? If it wanted to do a 5-point turn.
Well, it could, if it sort of really wanted to, it could sort of move up and down, but
it could a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
Is a swept path as tight as this normal for new developments?
Yes, I'd say that we've provided swept paths of this nature.
Can you illustrate some? Can you tell me of another development where there's a swept path as tight as that?
I'd have to.
Yeah, I don't mean this instance.
Yeah, I'd have to have a think.
But I mean, if that's the case, can you show me a swept path for another development that has actually been built out?
It might be that my colleague at London Borough of Croydon would be able to provide an example.
Right, okay. Nearly there. Now, you talked about services on Sunday, and that at other times you didn't expect the attendance to be higher than needed for the number of spaces. Did you hear Reverend Dr. Collins' evidence at the start of the week?
No.
When he talked about, and I'll probably get the day wrong, but I think it was very popular Tuesday services. Very popular services during the week. Were you aware of that?
It's not something that, when you say very popular, was there a sort of an attendance?
Maybe
I think you've
maybe I've got that wrong.
That one wrapped somewhere inappropriate.
Yeah, it does happen.
Would you like?
Yes, I very.
Dr. Collins to clarify.
You told me about some other services that you hold. Yes, please do. that are very popular. And I wonder if you could tell me again about those.
I think yesterday I made reference to two activities that I would be delighted if you'd had the opportunity to observe, and indeed anybody else.
I can't because we're here.
Yes, it's a conundrum. No, on Tuesday I referred to a group called Cameo that meets.
Right.
And Cameo, which stands for Come and Meet Each Other, is a midweek kind of service or meeting for our older folk, our retired folk. I'm supposed to say retired folk. And that takes place in our church hall, not this room here, but the church hall just over there. Okay. And might attract, on a busy week, a maximum of 40 to 50 people, I suppose. And then the other group I referred to was our toddler group, which meets on a Wednesday morning. That might attract somewhat more. Many of whom will drive. Many of whom will walk. I haven't done any kind of detailed analysis of that. But yes, I mean, we're not talking about the hundreds.
That's extremely. No, my misunderstanding, would apologise, was that when you said the hall, I thought you meant 200 people in here.
Yes, no, but it was generally referred to this as the auditorium. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so thank you for that.
Okay.
That's dealt with that one. Final question, which isn't particularly to do with this, but I like to ask every highways engineer that I come across. Other than at junctions where there's pedestrian crossings within a street, say within a high street, and there's no junction, it's just a question of pressing the button and waiting for the lights to change. There's always a delay before the lights change, and in my experience, a good percentage of the time, the pedestrians have actually crossed after the first car, and then the lights change to red, and they're on the other side, and then the cars that come along have to wait. Do you know why that is?
So
I'm not picking on you personally. I've asked every highway engineer I've come across recently, and I haven't had a good reply.
This is like the judge who...
this is my chance, isn't it?
This is like the judge who was hearing a case involving British Airways, and he asked the chief executive where his luggage had gone.
It's not quite that personal. But...
so traditional signalised pedestrian crossings work on a cycle. And they have a minimum and a maximum green time. So depending on when you come along and press the button, you may have to wait a different amount of time.
I understand that, but I'm suspicious that some of them there's always a delay. Have I got that wrong? If nobody had pressed the button for 5 minutes, would it turn immediately?
It would potentially turn. I mean, obviously there's an intergreen period for safety reasons. But you could potentially come along and get within 5 seconds.
Right.
That is possible. I don't know if you're aware of the new types of crossings which actually have detectors on them.
Yes.
And if pedestrians do cross early, it can detect that, and it actually cancels the call, which avoids delays to vehicles.
Right.
So that's also something that's available, because, as you say, sometimes vehicles...
It doesn't help the pedestrians.
It doesn't help the pedestrians, but it helps the vehicles.
It helps the nonsense.
There is another technology which is to extend the green time. So if you have someone particularly slow crossing the road, it also detects that and gives them extra time.
Yeah, I've heard of that as well, and something for cyclists too.
On toucans, yeah.
That's right. I love that toucan.
Yeah.
There we go. Mr. Gatkowski, any re-examination?
Just a couple of points, thank you. If you just bear with me for one moment. And the first point, Mrs. Balboa, is to do with the keep clear point that was put to you. Now, Mr. King read something from a letter from Transport for London, and just to ensure that if the inspector wishes to follow that reference through, the inspector understands quite what letter was being read from. The letter that Mr. King read from is in Appendix A to your transport assessment. So we know your TA is core document 1.13. It's a letter, it's contained in a scoping correspondence, and it's a letter dated the 19th of September 2013. It's part of the scoping exercise, way before the application. All right, and it's on the 4th page of that letter that one finds the sentence that Mr. King read out. If you'd like to remind yourself of it, because it'll take you an age to find it in this arm-breaking book. There's the letter.
So if you go to page 73, you'll find there.
Page 73 of the electronic version, so you'll see that that's the scoping letter you of 2013. All right?
Yep.
Now,
Yep, got that, thank you.
of course, that was then. Did TfL then comment on the actual planning application itself? That's part of the scoping correspondence you've got there, so that's all pre the application, do you remember? Yeah.
Yes, they did.
And do we find, the answer to this is yes, by the way, the TfL letter in the core documents? It's in volume 4, it's core document 7.6. Now, I don't know whether you've got easy access or not. If not,
I haven't
you
got
can
that one in
just,
front of me.
you can just, pardon me?
I haven't got that
No,
one
in
front
that
of
case,
me.
I'd simply pass mine across to you. That letter is dated the 14th of July 2016, so if you just remind yourself of that letter, is that the letter of TfL's comments on the planning application, as opposed to their years before comments in the early days of discussions?
That's correct, yes.
Yes. Now, I don't know whether you can remember, you can just turn the pages, it's a sort of typical TfL type letter, it's relatively lengthy.
I won't accuse you of leading if you take us to the right page.
Well, the whole point is there isn't a right page, because the question is,
okay,
did TfL repeat the point in their correspondence on the planning application itself? Now, I was unable to find any such reference, so that's the point, there isn't a page.
No, they were happy with the access as we'd proposed it.
Yeah, thank you.
There's no word clear on it.
Thank you. Good. And then the only other point I want to ask you about, if you can give me back that top volume, and do you have easily available to you the zip car study that you referred to? Do you remember you were asked? Yeah, could you? Because I'd rather keep mine here because we're going to be.
Is that a cause? It's in the TA, is it?
It's in the TA, sir. That's right. And Mr. Bias or Mrs. Balboa will give you the page reference. I'm using the.
It's the very last appendix.
It's the very last appendix. So it's Appendix I, the zip car report. And I don't know whether we have a page number to give you, sir, to help you with that. But you'll remember the inspector's...
Yeah, I've got it.
Thank you, sir. The inspector's point, which I just want to pick up with you as well, one space for the car club implies, well, the inspector made it explicit, if you like, but implies that it isn't anticipated that there'd be much usage. He then said, well, the space, in fact, would be available, because it's on the street, it'd be available for not just the residents of the scheme, but residents more generally in the area, to which the inspector said, well, therefore, there'd be even less use. I think we should just try and understand better the way in which car clubs work. So if we look at the zip car document, if we could just jump to the one's car club space first of all. So if we go to page, it's numbered page 4 of the zip car document. I'm not sure what page that would be on the...
It's 189.
Thank you. So it's under the heading of development viability. Do you have that at the top of your page? And on that page, if we go down 1, 2, 3, 4, back to the 4th paragraph, do we find in the 3rd line we anticipate 1 car club vehicle should be required?
Yep.
Is that what you had in mind when you were...
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Now, if we just try and put in context what 1 club vehicle actually does, if at the top of the page do we find the zip car telling us that they've been operating in Croydon since 2005, they now work in partnership with the council, currently have 55 vehicles in the borough and over 1,900 members. So does that give us some form of understanding, if you like, of the ratio of membership to the number of vehicles that are required?
Yes, you could take that. You could take an average vehicle
exactly.
per membership.
Yeah, because what do people use car club vehicles for? Are they, if you like, a complete substitute for owning your own car, or are they used in different ways?
So a car club would normally be used for people who don't have access to a car on a regular basis. So They would most likely commute using public transport, do their shopping on foot or by public transport, but need very occasional use to a car club. So, for example, if they wanted to visit a friend, or if they were moving house, for example, or wanted to make a purchase involving bulky items, they could use the car club. That's really the purpose of it.
Yeah, very much. And if we just look at that, just to verify that, if you like, on the same page that we've been referring to, the development viability page, in the first paragraph we're told that the cars that they have are currently performing well, being used approximately 8 to 10 hours a day. Car club would work well at this location given support from the developer in the early phases. Current proximity to local transport links is very good. They then understate the PTAL, don't they? They say here it's approximately 4, in fact it's 5, which is encouraging for the car club's chances of success, as synergy with public transport links is a key contributor to good car club performance. This makes it likely that the residents of this development will not need a car for work, essential to the success of the scheme. So what's the point they're making there then?
Well, the point they're making is that if residents own a car, they're less likely to use the car club. So the idea is that residents are more likely to use a car club if they live in an area of good public transport accessibility and don't need to own their own car to use on a regular basis.
Very much indeed. And if you just bear with me for one moment. And just to bring that into play, if you look at what's the second page of this document, it's the first page of text. So it's a page that's got the map of the United Kingdom on it, if that helps. Yeah. And to the right-hand side of that, do we find some information about Zipcar? And second down on the right-hand side, 71% use Zipcar for leisure, spontaneous and activities. Does that assist to understand the use of these car clubs?
Yes, I think that supports what I've said, which is that it's not for people that own a car and need to commute in their car. It's for more ad hoc or leisure uses. Yeah,
thank you. And then if we just try and understand what Zipcar understand as the effect of each of their cars, if you like. So if we look on the second page of the text of this document, page 3, under the heading of a sustainable transport solution. So it's a page in between the ones that we've been referring to already. Second paragraph down, just beside the weighing scales, which rather graphically make the point, every Zipcar takes an average of 10 to 15 privately owned cars off the roads because members often sell or don't replace a car when they join. Does that help us to understand the proposition?
Yes, again, this is something that Zipcar quite often quote, and the idea is that you wouldn't actually need to own a car if you were a member of a car club.
Yeah, indeed so. Good. Thank you very much indeed. So those are my few questions in re-examination.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. Thank you for taking me to that document. A couple of things arising out of that. 220 flats, each Zipcar takes 10 to 15 off the road. Doesn't that mean that there should be, through the travel plan or otherwise, some greater incentive for people to use the club?
Yes, in fact, it's proposed to give free membership to the club for the first 3 years for each resident.
Thank you. Well, that covers my next question, so that's excellent, because I saw that in the recommendation as well. But I'm wondering that if there is a good take-up of, there'll all be members if there's a good take-up of interest. In other words, people say, well, I don't need a car, I'll commute by public transport and I'll just use this out of hours. If a Zipcar is the equivalent to 10 to 15 cars, it's not making much inroads into the car requirements of 220 flats if there's only one space. Or have I missed something here?
I think there's various points there. First of all, we don't expect residents of this development to need to use a car very often. There is very good access to public transport and to other local facilities which you can walk or get the train or bus to. The provision of a car club is obviously very useful because it does mean that any residents that might have concerns about not owning a car, they know that they'll have access to the car club. And Zipcar, of course, is actually a commercial operation, so they will provide as many car club spaces in the area as they feel there is a demand. We will be promoting the use of the car club through the travel plan and through the fact that there is free membership for the first 3 years. And if Zipcar felt that there was demand for a second space, I would imagine that that's something that they would take up with TfL and with Croydon to provide. It's not proposed right now as part of this development, but it's certainly something that could be provided at a later date.
So what you're saying is that TfL could provide a non-street parking space for Zipcar or whoever
yes,
at a later date. How would that work?
So at the moment we're proposing to provide our car club space on street on Banstead Road. Yep. So it would be possible to provide a second space if TfL were agreed to it on the road route, or perhaps further away on one of the local roads with Croydon, and it would simply be a matter of agreeing that with Croydon and arranging the traffic orders. Right.
But as far as you're concerned, one on-street space is enough?
Yes, so Zipcar have analysed the site, they've recommended one, and that's been provided and obviously then accepted by the highway authorities as appropriate.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deb.
Right, we'll break now then until 5 to 12. The inquiry is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Splendid. Could you make copies and so? Thanks. Right. You've missed the chance. Your evidence is gone. By all means, ask her outside the inquiry. She may be able to help you. Oh, of course, yeah.
Excuse me, can I speak to the trustee? Because it's my first time in this. Now, you mentioned there's an entrance in West Lane in Ireland. Well, if there's a fire and that's blocked off, is there emergency exit access? So could the fire engines come in somewhere else? I just wanted to know. No, the fire engines will drive into the site. Secondly, you mentioned about the zip card. You said if you have in the right space, they could do one against the foot.
We're proposing to put one in.
Which is that one. Yes.
We'll just take it step by step. Okay. You'll just answer it. In terms of the issues, you'll just leave me to step the appropriate yes, I'll give you the names if you like. at it, yeah.
I will. There was a scheme.
My husband's been operation well, so I'm going to find out and see him.
Yes.
I'd like to be able to drop this this afternoon. Is that what's going to happen?
I should imagine that's happening.
I mean, I've done some bits.
Yes.
Lovely.
Okay. Asking questions. Someone else could ask questions for the rest of
Not the one of us sitting there, but one of the chaps sitting behind me.
Yes. Someone else could ask on behalf of the Residents Association. As long as they introduce themselves and explain who they are and so on. Yeah, of course.
You're in church.
Yes, true.
I know, I agree.
If he keeps questioning his good details to get out of those couple of money. Yeah, I think she's done really well. And the way the
you can make that forward.
If you ask a question.
because Gerald, if it's relevant to talk about in all our schemes, we have leftover parking. Yeah.
You should, absolutely. You should say in all your schemes, leftover parking, and there's an example in Purley, not at one of yours, but an example in Purley. 20 spaces, only 4 star, but I mean, it's
a generation thing.
It is a generation.
Do you want to have tea, sorry? Dereliction of duty, so let me go to, would you like this?
Bit fresh. Yeah. Jury's out on that one. But I don't. What I do is I'll say it's all there in detail, but I'll ask you to summarise your understanding of the position. Yeah. Put all the details written down. So. Oh, you. Yes, that's it.
Right, will everyone take their seats, please, and could somebody close the door behind you?
Yes.
Thank you. Good luck too.
He's put the Jolly Farmers, but I think the Jolly Farmers is a bit too far.
Where would be the one when you come out?
Right, the inquiry is resumed. Mr. Katkowski, I never like to presume, but I think I can guess who your next witness is going to be.
That's right, so we'd like to keep everyone on their toes. So I'm going to call Mr. Cunningham, and so you will know that Mr. Cunningham, if you like, originally appeared in the form of a written statement.
I have it in front of me.
Thank you very much, which for others who wish to follow is Appendix B to Mr. Pearson's documents, to his proof. And so I will use that, if you like, as a way of just setting the scene. Now, the reason, just to explain, the reason I'm calling Mr. Cunningham is so because of a number of questions that you raised, in particular of the Minister yesterday, and we are just concerned to ensure that the record is as clear as possible, if you like, in relation to various issues such as viability, ownership, who will own what, and so on and so forth. And while we're at it, I use Mr. Cunningham to just help with a few other points as well. So I wonder whether we can just set the scene as to who you are, Mr. Cunningham. So if you look at your written statement, you indicate at the beginning of that you're director of a Thornset group. And I wonder if I can just ask you to read the paragraphs 2, 3 and 4, I think. We'll just do as a scene setter. Is that appropriate to you?
That's fine. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Is the microphone okay?
Who knows? I can hear you, but I always like it when people say, can everyone hear me? Because if they can't, then how do they know you've asked the question?
I have moved to asking people if they can indicate at the back that they can hear me, and that seems to work a bit better.
Can you hear me at the back okay?
Yes,
thank you. Good morning, Mr. Nicholson. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. I'm Gerard Cunningham. I'm the Managing Director and Founding Director of Thornset Group. Thornset Group was formed back in 1986 by myself and my brother Dennis, which extended from a further family business with other members of the family prior to that. Since then, we've built and developed a wide range of community buildings and facilities, including churches, youth clubs, health centres, cultural buildings and sporting facilities. The community infrastructure is enabled by residential development and will often include shops, offices and other commercial accommodation. Thornset takes a very collaborative and hands-on approach across every stage of the development. In these projects, we partner with the land-owning charity initially, before moving on to a briefing of architects and then securing planning permission and funding following that. Our role continues with the project through management of the construction process and extends beyond the finished development to include marketing, letting and sales. Thornset's clients value the strength of the relationship with us. At Thornset, we seek to be reliable and straightforward partners, and the way that we work helps set us apart from other competitors. Many of our projects are in the charity and church sector, come with recommendations and from the solidity of our track record.
If we just pause there, so just to try and understand Thornset Group, which after all is one of the two joint applicants here for this planning permission, I wonder if you can just help, when compared to the more bulk or bog standard developer, are you working in a particular niche or particular part of the market in relation to partnering up with charities, churches, other community bodies? Is that the mainstay of your work?
This is indeed the mainstay, but that is our speciality, if you like. We currently are working with a number of at this moment in time, for example, we're currently building 3 churches. So despite all the discussion here around planning, this is the stage we've already been through with a number of projects. And currently at this moment in time, we're working with United Reformed Church in Clapton, building a new church there. We're building a new church at Bethnal Green Mission Church, and we're nearing completion of a new church in Battersea, all which are structured on a very similar basis as this project, where we work together with the landowning, the charity, the local authority, all of the other partners.
I missed the middle one of those. Clapton and Battersea.
Battersea, and it's Bethnal Green Mission Church.
Bethnal Green.
Excuse me.
And are those 3 all in your appendices?
Yes, they are. All the detail is in our appendices. Thank you.
Good.
Please continue.
And in addition to that, we're currently working with the Department of Education on a new primary school in Hackney, again facilitated by 71 apartments, which we have sold to Dolphin Charitable Foundation, who in turn will make those available for social housing. So the entire scheme has been worked together to provide a new school and 71 affordable homes in Hackney.
Thank you very much indeed. So then, I wonder if you could bring us from the macro to the micro, if you like. So can you just help, please, say a few words to set the scene as to Thornset's involvement with this particular site and the build-up to this scheme that's in front of this inspector now. So can you just help, please, with an outline, if you like, of your involvement and what you did when you got involved?
Indeed. A lot has been talked about here about the length of time this development has been in discussion and underway. Our involvement started back in July 2012 when my co-director Bernadette met with the former Minister Peter Nodding, who explained to Bernadette at a church gathering that they were struggling to get the development of their new church off the ground, had listened to Bernadette's presentation to that group and asked her, would Thornset look at what their proposals were and see?
No, you're going to have to I know that you know that it's going to only be a minute or two into your presentation when I was going to say this. Slow down a little bit.
Okay, thank you. I did ask Christopher to slow me down. I do get a bit nervous in these situations, and he's kindly said he'll put the reins on me. So thank you for that, Christopher. Yes, indeed. So once that discussion started, Bernard and I came and had one of the many coffees we've had at Costa Coffee here in Purley to discuss the opportunity. We looked initially at the scheme which was referred to many times over the last 2 days, the scheme that had previous planning permission, and we looked at the viability of that scheme. And we were very quick to say to the church that it doesn't stack up viably. We do a very simple exercise of you put together all the costs of the project, the construction costs, the income, and is it viable? Could it work? Could it be funded? And it was not fundable. It was not viable. We then started looking in a very informal way initially with the church to try and establish, is there a way forward to develop the site to give the church their requirements? And we did say, and we had robust conversations which subsequently carried on into discussions with Croydon Council about the size of the facility. And as you heard yesterday, the church now is substantially less than it was then, and indeed more available for the church. So we have to start at that point.
So just take a step back. So just pause for a moment. So the church was substantially larger in the early days. Let's start with that point about the church, then we'll come on to the community facilities side. So just help us, please, what happened in these early discussions, when you were probing and testing things in relation to the size of the church that the church aspired to, if you
Indeed. We started, our core focus has and remains all the way through this project to maintain viability, because unless the scheme is viable, it will never get built. So we kept that focus all the way through. It started with looking at what the church's requirements are and what possible size of scheme might be needed to support that. It also meant that we had to look at what was the planning policy at that time, and we very quickly, I refer to it as my squash and the squeeze, where we looked at and this is only the island site at this time, where we looked at the entire site and said, what can we fit on this to give the church their reasonable facilities, and what can we do to provide housing that makes it viable? We then went through the countless permutations of height and massing to get to a scheme where we could consult with the council on what likely to get approval and how that would stack up viable. So there was 4 years of many schemes worked through to get to the point where we kept the viability going through.
And in relation to the size of the church, so did the church originally have aspirations for a larger facility than what they've ended up with, if you like, in the planning application? Has that been one of the things which has had to be looked at in a pretty tough way?
It had to be talked to. There was very robust conversations around that, both in terms of managing the size of the church, making the church understand the flexibility of modern design of architect, that you didn't need every square foot of space for every activity. What you did was had multi-use space and like that. So we had to manage the church's expectation and experience in development. As James said yesterday, he's not experienced in development, and we helped to manage that process to make sure that we had a very efficient space for the church.
And then what happened in all of this to community uses, the ability to use the building for the proposed building for community uses?
There was very clear understanding with the church that they wanted to open their doors wider to the community, accepting that obviously it's a place of worship, but much wider use than that. As part of our early negotiations with the council, the discussion was that the community would be a substantial benefit to the local community in terms of the housing. At that time, we were dealing with a plan. The original scheme that was approved had no affordable housing, and under the local authority, we were dealing with the Conservative local authority at that time, there was an expectation that there would be no affordable housing, but the community facilities would provide the Section 106 requirements.
Okay, and we know that changed as time went by.
Indeed.
Thank you. Now, can you just help, please, because a number of questions were raised yesterday by the inspector of...
Mr. Kankowski, just before we move on, for your note, could I have a reference for the lack of expectation from the council previously in terms of affordable housing and then the change? Not now, but in due course. Or are you literally coming to it?
We will be coming to it fairly soon. And if when we come to it that's insufficient, then please indicate.
Will do.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. So, Mr. Cunningham, what I wanted to ask you to deal with next, I think before we come to the south site, if you like, is if you can just help, please, with the way in which, in relation to evolving a scheme, on the site, which then obviously led to the planning application. How was viability tested? I mean, you've referred to looking at all sorts of different options. How important was this to the process, testing viability?
Well, viability was hugely important from every level. If the scheme in itself wasn't viable, it could never get off the ground, so therefore it would never get to happen. More importantly, the viability test is part of a planning process whereby one has to do a viability test to get the local authority to approve it, and indeed they get it independently approved to make sure that the scheme isn't making super profit, that the scheme is delivering community benefit, and indeed, if need be, affordable housing.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, you refer to all sorts of different permutations. I think your expression was squash and squeeze, is that right? So I just want you to help with this, because obviously there's been reference to the previously permitted scheme, in which fairly early on in Thornset's involvement you analysed that, and as you've explained, it was found to be unfundable, unviable. Just in case there's some thought that what's happened here is, well, the permitted scheme was looked at, found not to be viable, and then, if you like, Thornset and the church just jumped to this scheme with its tall building. Do you remember we had yesterday some raised by the residents' associations to some extent, raised by the inspector to some other extent, you know, possibility of different permutations of development on the site and so on and so forth. So just help, please, if you can. To what extent were a variety of different ways of developing the site looked at in order to find a scheme which is viable and which could produce a new church, new community facilities, and then the homes to fund those items?
Yeah, there were many workshops with our architects and the council design officers and indeed ourselves to try and look at the development to get a high quality scheme. It was very clear from the planning policy that there was a desire for a tall building at the end. So we didn't come up with the idea that we should put a tower there for maximum development. The planning policy that was referred to yesterday from the local plan and indeed the London plan was steering us in that direction. However, we, with the church's support, worked through countless schemes looking at how would it appeal to, in architectural terms, the look of this scheme and in a design context. And when the squash and the squeeze were referred to, we did almost a low-rise scheme on the entire site, but it was far too bulky, far too massive. And in the documents that have been produced, there's a lot of examples of these schemes. Mm-hmm. We then evolved the design through the process of the design officers and the architectural expertise to say the right solutions to comply with planning policy that we were dealing with, to give it the elegancy and the height that they wanted a landmark building, that this was the right site for a landmark building. We then, where we started with a much fatter, taller tower, we had to slim that down, and the whole process was one of constant engagement, constant involvement, constant design input, and what was said a number of times yesterday, trying to ensure that we had really building of very high quality and indeed giving public realm, and this whole scheme has been about managing all of the requirements and everybody's expectations to come to a scheme that's an optimum scheme from the planning point of view and still maintaining viability and excellent architecture.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Now, obviously there's been a great deal of focus on the island site. We know that in terms of the chronology leading up to the planning application, the south site was brought in that process of evolution. Mm-hmm. So can you just help, please, how do we find ourselves with the south site as part of this overall proposition? And I wonder if you can just help us with, also, if you can, with the extent to which Croydon the council was testing the economic viability issues and so on around the proposals. Can you just help the inquiry with that?
Indeed. In parallel with all of the architectural discussion, design discussion, there was a very robust conversation around the economics of the building and the requirement then is in the passage of time for affordable housing on the development. It was also very robust with the church. The church were being challenged constantly on the size of the premises, as I referred to earlier on, but also looking at their other assets. And it was as a result of the council recognising that they wanted to get affordable housing, the viability wasn't testing. The church were forced to look at their assets, and indeed the first were effectively I would say encouraged, but more than encouraged by the council, say the land across the road at Bannister Road, approximately 1/3 of that land was owned by the church. And the council said, if you put that land into the scheme, that will give us some affordable housing. So that started us on the road of building up a percentage of affordable housing within the viability of the scheme.
Okay. So the church-owned land across the road, so to speak, is literally brought into the scheme. But we know that you've said that's about 1/3 of the land. So what about the rest of the land?
Indeed. Well, the other two parts of land on the flats number, the land number 7 to 9, the higher end numbers, that was owned by Eldon Housing Association. Eldon Housing Association were keen to get some affordable housing. They had a single building on the site, which wasn't very efficient, and had aspirations for affordable housing. Again, Thornsett involvement, we managed then to work with the agreement of the church that they would put in the land off the middle side. The Eldon, I had many meetings with. They said they would be very interested. And on the corner, you'll all be familiar with the first section of the site, which you'll see, Mr. Nicholson, tomorrow on your walk around, was privately owned. So we effectively pulled together the entire team to ensure that we could develop the land, which then allowed for us to get into the context. And we started with a possibility of something in the order of 10 to 15% affordable housing on the entire scheme. Mm-hmm. We then, Eldon were very adamant and we had a lot of work to do to keep them in the party, because they were insistent that their land, their current footprint on 7 to 9 was retained by them and given back to them with their new facilities. So we had to design around their requirements on that land. But more importantly, it took away any opportunity to do anything else with that site other than residential. And indeed, it is residential zoned anyway, from a planning point of view.
So just pause. Let's slow down.
Thank you.
Or at least pause you. So, because of the testing by the council, and entirely commendable if I might say, the church looked to their other land ownership interest across the road. So some land is brought in at Bansard Road into the scheme. Thornsett, if I understand what you were saying, if I've understood correctly, then also had to negotiate to bring in some privately, so non-church owned, non-Eldon Housing Association land. Correct. On the corner of the site, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
The tip of the site, so to speak. And the Eldon Housing Association were brought into the scheme as well, but as I understand it, on the basis that they were, I mean, again, commendably, if you like, insisting that their land should feature as affordable housing. Have I got that right?
That is correct, yes.
Exactly. So we have the church, in effect, donating land into the scheme, acquisition of control of the tip of the site from a private owner, and Eldon Housing Association coming in, but on the basis, as I think you explained just now, that they would get their land back. So, well, they would never part company with their land.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Good. So, and whilst this is all going on, can you just help us, please, with the extent to which the economics and viability were being scrutinised and looked at by the council, rather than, I don't know, them just accepting your say-so about things?
Well, yeah, in the passage of time, there was the scheme has had to take, as I've said, big hits along the way. There had to be management of all of the costs, increasing construction costs. At that time, we had some increase in sales prices as well, but as everybody knows, that has stabilised very much in the last couple of years. But additionally, there was community infrastructure levy, which was brought in, and that's a massive cost of almost £2.5 million to a project.
I think we're up to about 3 million.
It's nearly 3 million.
Yes.
Quite right. It creeps up. So there's this constant stress on the scheme, whereby the viability was a real struggle. Construction costs were increasing. We had the increased tax coming on the scheme. We had holding costs both for the church and everybody else. So the costs were increasing constantly to get us to a point where we had to manage that. The final squeeze was put back on Thornsett, where everybody said, "Okay, Mr. Thornsett, can you give anything to this?" So as is reported in the PMB Powerbay report, we're working on a smaller margin than is acceptable at government level and at viability level nationally, to allow us to do some work on this.
So just pause there. So in order to bring forward this scheme, and of course not as a fantasy, but as a scheme that would actually be delivered in the real world if permission is granted.
Correct.
Has the church had to manage its expectations?
Very much so.
Yep. Eldon come in, but on the basis that they retain their land, but that there should be affordable housing.
Correct.
Thank you. Obviously there are the policy bills, the SIL requirements and so on, the tax that has to be paid. And then, if you like, perhaps to you personally, the sort of the squeeze, if you like, on Thornset's profits.
That's
so have
correct.
you, in the work that's been done, accepted a lower return than what a developer would expect in a standard, for example, a standard residential scheme?
Yes, we have.
Yeah. Thank you. And is that all documented? I mean,
That's all documented, and that's all on the reports from the viability testing.
Exactly. So while we're looking at that, so you've got, in relation to the build costs, I mean, we've all heard about the quality of the scheme. I'd like to think that nobody would think there's anything other than the high quality scheme. Does that come with a cost attached to it?
It does indeed, yes.
Yes, thank you. Public realm and the giving to the public realm, does that come with a cost attached to it?
Yes, it does.
And so on and so forth. Obviously, the church and the community facilities presumably are a cost of the scheme as well.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed. Now, can you just help me with this? Just in case there's any thought that the church will be taking some form of big profit out of this scheme at the end of the day, can you just help us, please? What does the church get out of this? Because you're the master of the deal, if you like. What does the church get out of this?
The church currently get out of this. There's a very clear. We have entered into a development agreement with the church. This is how we get a legal position within the entire project. So therefore, the church, ourselves, and interested parties have entered into a very complex development agreement where we, Thornset, have to secure and procure the planning permission.
Yep.
That's our first obligation. Yep. And indeed, we, Thornset, take all the costs, and we carry all the costs of that, and we are at risk. So at this moment in time, Thornset have invested in excess of £2 million of external cash to support the regeneration of Purley. So this is a very serious project for a family business, and we're committed to this fully. And therefore, that is a massive investment that we want to manage. Could you remind me of the second half of your question?
What's the church? Just in case, because there's a little bit of a tone yesterday that, and I found it very insidious, I have to say, but the church might walk away from this with lots of cash in the bank, if you like. So let's just put that one to rest, please.
Yes, indeed. The church, the development agreement provides for us to repay the debt of the church on this land, and that doesn't cover all of the money that James referred to yesterday in terms of the 4 million collected. There is debt on this land, it's in the public record, of just around £1.3 million. We have an obligation to repay that from the development, and the reason for that is, unless we repay that debt, we cannot have an unencumbered asset, and therefore it's non-fundable. Okay, so first thing, you must pay down the debt to fund the development.
So if the site still carried that debt, as I understand it, are you explaining you would not be able to fund the scheme?
It makes it much more difficult to fund it because the bank, as we all know in the current world of banking, like clean, unencumbered, non-complicated assets.
Okay. So in order to make the asset unencumbered, the project, if you like, has to repay that debt that the church has incurred.
Correct.
Of, I think it's just under £1.3 million, I think.
That's correct, yes.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. Okay. And apart from that, so that has to be done, otherwise, we can all whistle Dixie, if you like, for development on this site. So that has to be done. What else does the church get?
The church gets their new facility, which, as we've discussed yesterday, built, but not fitted out. So we finished the building. We say if you turn it upside down and anything that falls, the church has to put in there. So just to try and paint a picture of what it is that you get.
I've never heard that.
So we're not furnishing it. We're not putting in the kit. We're not putting in all these lovely cameras and things. We're just finishing the finished building. So that's what the church gets.
Remember that for future inquiries. So
I missed it. What was the phrase?
If you turn the building upside down, anything that falls to the ceiling is not included. I think that's right. It helps. We try to keep it simple.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So they get.
In your development agreement.
It is, but maybe not that language, but certainly it's in our development.
That's the colloquial translation of many pages of legalese, I should think.
Exactly. In addition, the church they get the facility and they get 2 apartments for church workers' use.
Okay, thank you very
much. But we must remind ourselves then there's on the other side, the church they've given the land here, so the whole site they've contributed to the scheme, and in addition they've contributed the site across the road. So this church are they've put in a substantial amount of asset value into this development to make it viable.
Yes, thank you very much indeed.
Can I just pick up and another point on that? as is clearly documented in the Section 106 agreement, there is a clawback position on this agreement. So if there is a super profit made, should the world change and construction costs go down and sales go up, which we're questioning at the moment with all this goes on, but there is seriously a very detailed viability test following the completion of the development, and in the event there is further profit made than we projected, the council are entitled to a substantial share of that profits to provide affordable housing, albeit at this stage the affordable housing would not be on site, of course, because we'd have completed development, but there would be a cash payment to allow Croydon to develop affordable housing elsewhere in the borough.
Okay.
So a second point, if I may, Mr. on the Eldon Housing Association, it's very important to understand that there's an allocation of grant towards that scheme.
Right.
That is available in the current window because of our expectation of planning permission last April. Mm-hmm. That grant runs away, and again, there's risk to the scheme of the grant money falling away and therefore the whole scheme falling apart. At this moment in time, and it's worth being really clear on the affordable housing, I've mentioned Eldon. In addition to Eldon Housing Association, who will take some of their units, there are other units on the site which will not retain Melbourne, and we have contracted with Amicus Horizon to manage the 39 affordable units. Yes. It's Amicus Horizon who have grant and are anxious to get the scheme off the ground so that the grant is secured for Croydon.
So while they've got, is there in effect a window of opportunity?
There's a current window. It's granted, it's time limited. We were under extreme pressure to get started in this September. Clearly we haven't done. We've had managed to get it extended by, I believe, 12 months, but there is significant pressure on that grant at the moment.
Okay. Righty-ho. So the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle. Good. Thank you for that. And then I think I would just like your assistance, and so there is a note that's been prepared in relation to this, but there were some questions asked yesterday about who's going to end up owning what, if you like, in relation to all of this. So there is a note that's been prepared. I'll just have that distributed. It's been prepared by the... Thank you very much. So this will be document 9, I think.
Document 9 indeed.
So I'm not going to ask Mr. Cunningham to read this note out, but I'll just wait for you to clip it. But so you'll see there's a 2-page note, which when people have the chance to read it, explains in, it's been prepared by the relevant firm of solicitors, explains in detail the ownership structure. There are then two, I hope helpful diagrams explaining the ownership structure that would result for the island site on the one hand and 1 to 5 Banstead Road. And there is an important point to bear in mind here, that that's 1 to 5 Banstead Road, so you'll know that the southern site is more than that. That's because, as has been explained, the land that's owned by Eldon will always stay in Eldon's hands. It's never going to wash through anyone else, if you like. So, and that has been added to the note in handwriting on the second page of the note, if you've just got a handwritten edition there.
And theirs is 7 to 9, is that right?
Theirs is 7 to 9, that's right.
So that covers
9.
Yeah.
So that it's, I hope, not too complex a note. I'm going to ask Mr. Cunningham to just explain this, I hope in relatively straightforward terms, whether by use of any other analogies or not, I don't know. But the detail, if you like, is here. So just in case, well, it's obvious from yesterday, there were some misapprehensions perhaps about who's going to end up owning what. So could you just give us an overview of the situation, please, to the best of your understanding?
Yes, indeed. The ownership of the site, there was reference to the 5812 group, and my understanding 5812 group is what I would call a subsidiary of the church, and that is the group to allow the development to take place, but also to be a trading company. In our experience with a lot of the charities we deal with, most of the charities will have a trading company because that allows them to do the trade, take income from their other activities or community activities that are paid for, recover their VAT, all of that. So there's a very sensible business structure as to why there would 5812 would be the church representative company in this structure. when the project is completed under the terms of our development agreement, I'll deal with the island side first. The freehold will stay with the church. From that, Thornsett Purley Limited, you'll guess it's in the name because of this development, will get a 253-year lease from the 5812 to give us the opportunity. That is our legal interest in the land. From that lease, we will then settle on. We'll give the church the 2 community units. We will give the church their facility, the entire facility, on a long lease, and we will then sell off the individual long leases to individual buyers of the apartments for the scheme. But the freehold always stays with the church, and the leasehold, 253-year leasehold interest, stays with Thornsett for us to dispose to the relevant parties. Okay. The reason for the 53, it allows the period of time for building, so that a buyer would typically get 250-year lease.
Right. So the structure for the island site is freeholders. Well, it's 5812 who has the freehold, right, keeps the freehold. You carve out of that a head lease, 253 years, to Thornsett Purley, and then Thornsett Purley carve out of their head lease a sublease to 5812 of the community buildings, church, and so on, and also two of the flats. Yep, correct. I've got this right. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we have a situation where, well, what about all the other flats, all the other apartments? Well, as you've said, Thornsett then would grant leases to whoever comes along to buy those flats, and those leases, as you've explained, would similarly be for 253 years, but minus 3 days to make sure that they come back to Thornsett, if you like. Yeah. Okay. So that's the structure for the island site. I hope that helps. And then for the southern site, bearing in mind that we must keep in mind that part of it always stays with Eldon. Mm-hmm. So the rest of it, the part that doesn't stay with Eldon, what happens to that? Is it a sort of similar situation?
Yeah. Currently, as I mentioned earlier, there's 3 sections of land. 1 to 3 Banstead Road is privately owned, and we, Thornsett, have an option from the private owner to acquire that site on receipt of planning permission, of an implementable planning permission. Yes. So that's how we've secured our position on 1 to 3. Mm-hmm. 3 to 5 is owned currently by the Baptist Church, and we again, Thornsett, have.
Sorry, you said 1 to 3, 3 to 5.
Sorry, I've got the numbers wrong. 5 to 7. I beg your pardon. 5 to 7. Yeah. It's first the chat. And again, through our legal development agreement, the church have given us an option on that, which will form into the structure of the development as soon as we get an implementable planning permission.
And I'm confused now, because 7 to 9 is...
Yeah, no, let's just pause to make sure we've got these.
Let's get the numbers right.
Let's get the numbers right. So wait a minute, hold on 1 moment.
5 to 7. And then 7... 3 to 5.
Let me just note at this stage that there are 3 owners. The private on which you've got an option, the church and Eldon, and in due course you can tell me exactly which is
thank you.
Just checking the note from Stevenson Harwood, actually, just to check.
That's where it is. I beg your pardon.
Right.
That's what it is.
So number one was is the one that you've got the option on. Yep. 3 to 5 is the church. 3 to 5 is the church, and then 7 to 9. 7 to 9 we'll get there in the end. 7 to 9 is Eldon. So that's it. So we've got there. Okay. So having got the numbers right, so then what happens?
So at this moment in time, as I said, the 3 plots are secured to Thornsett by way of effective options through the development agreement or options. Yeah. On an implementable planning permission, the land, we will develop out the land under the obligation of the agreement. We will do a very similar range where we will carve out the 253-year head lease to allow us to give Amicus Horizon some of their units which are on the land number 1, 3 and 5. Mm-hmm. Eldon will take their units that are on land 7 to 9. And at the end, when all of the private units are sold off and the development is completed, the freehold of number 1 and number 3 to 5 will go back to the Baptist Church.
Yeah. So the freehold is at the top of the chart.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So it's as I understand, similar. Apart from the Eldon land, which is quite different, but for the rest of the southern site, you have a freehold interest which is with the church, 5812, carved out of that 253-year head lease to Thornset Purley, and then carved out of that these various subleases to those who come along and purchase properties.
That is correct.
Yeah, okay. So the detail is in the, I hope sufficient detail is in the notes.
I hope so. I mean, I hope you understand my reason for asking these questions. It's a small chain. I'll just go through it in case you're not clear. It wasn't to suggest that the church is making a huge profit.
No, but
it was to do with the fact that the affordable housing doesn't comply with policy and yet is being sought as a benefit. It can comply with policy subject to viability.
Yes.
The viability studies deal with land value in different ways, and they do, I think. And therefore I want to be clear that I understand it correctly and can report to the Secretary of State exactly what the position is in terms of viability and whether the right proportion of affordable housing is being put forward.
Yes, no, I understand this.
That's my train of thought, in case you're worrying.
I think it's what others might have taken from the way in which you put some of your questions that concern me. And to put my cards face up on the table, I have to say that a number of the questions you raised yesterday did cause me genuine concern. Right. And that's why we're responding to them, and we'll continue to respond to them.
Well, I apologise if that was
No, and thank you for allaying my
maybe
concerns.
I should have, I thought I'd set out in advance that my duty here is to test the evidence.
I'd heard you say that, sir. Thank you very much
If I hadn't done so in sufficient detail, then I apologise. But that's the bit that I'm particularly keen to test.
I understand that, sir, and thank you for the clarification. Also, so subject to one caveat, and the caveat is this: I do not accept that 18% or whatever is doesn't comply with policy. One complies with the policy by providing as much affordable housing as the scheme can bear in viability terms. So it isn't a...
and I think I said that as a right.
Exactly.
Maybe I should have said it the other way around.
Exactly. So sorry to be picky, but it's important.
No, it is important.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
And as I say, it's just the worry that, a concern on my part, that some of the questions that you put, and I thank you very much for the clarification, some of the points that were put were then picked up by others, if you like, and used in a particular way. So I'm just a little bit concerned about that. But that's fine. You've explained very clearly the points from your perspective. And I hope, so this is helpful to you, just to explain.
It is the business of the previous scheme not wanting, or the earlier incarnation not wanting any affordable housing is something I hadn't picked up. So I would welcome those documents as well. But I do want to be... Mr. Cunningham said initially, under the previous control, that the council hadn't wanted. It was satisfied, is that right? That the community benefits were sufficient, and then more recently the affordable housing was sought. Be that as it may, I want to be sure that I have examined these viability reports in detail, that I understand the assumptions behind them.
Of course.
And one of those is land values.
Yes, of course, absolutely. The only question I want to just put back to you, sir, if I might, is it's entirely my fault, I'm sure. I'm not quite sure in my own mind what you mean by documents in relation to the position in relation to affordable housing, because certainly all of our evidence in relation to the evolution of the scheme is explained very clearly indeed. The southern site was brought into the equation in order to ensure that affordable housing could be provided, it not having been there, if you like, at the outset of the analysis. So for the first X however many of the years leading up to the planning application, for the early years of that evolution, it was simply the island site. Because of the rigorous, which we welcome, I have to say, and commend, because of the rigorous testing of the scheme by the council, commendably rigorous testing of the scheme by the council, the southern site is brought into the equation. This is all before the application, obviously. And one of the roles of the southern site being brought into the equation was to ensure that some affordable housing could be provided.
So that was the point at which that change in stance happened.
Yes, and it's all, and this is all way before the application goes in, obviously, as you understand, because the application's always had the southern site and it's always had affordable housing. So this is all prior to the application. Yeah. Good.
That's helpful, thank you.
And that has been documented and is documented in the evidence that we've given. It's there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, I don't pretend to have read every core document.
I'm with you on that, Sarah.
Some I will delve into much more detail after I've heard the evidence and I know where the areas of dispute are.
I'm entirely with you on that, because anyone who claimed to have read every page of these documents, I'd question their sanity. So
the case officer might have had to, but I don't think anyone else.
Well, in that case, I would say with that rare exception. Grand. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Mr. Cunningham, we'll just bring you in. We'll just bring you in now and bring you back. And I just want to, if we've hopefully sufficiently given an overview of the ownership structures and the notes there for the detail, and if there are any follow-up questions from the inspector in due course, then we'll try our best to assist. And I just want to go off on a tangent to deal with something completely different now, Mr. Cunningham, if we can move on. And that's simply from your perspective, as we've seen the experience you and Thornsett has in the field of providing this sort of mixed-use scheme with residential in it. Can you just help, please, with all this kerfuffle that's been made about car parking for the flats, for the apartments? So what is your real-world experience as to whether the generations that would be looking to purchase flats like these come to a site like this and think to themselves, well, where can I park my car?
Yeah, thank you. Our experience in many of our developments currently been built and recently built in London, that there is not the requirement for people to have car parking spaces. On every scheme without exception that we've built in recent years, we've had very limited number of car parking, because that's what planning policy is today. And even at the end of selling all of the private units and completing our affordable housing contribution, we still find ourselves with car parks available to sell subsequently. There is not the demand, that's the fact. We would say in this building, the one-bedroom flats, it's highly unlikely that anybody buying a one-bedroom flat within 3 minutes of the station will want to buy a car. And we believe that at the end of the day, the car park spaces we have allocated here will remain unsold in Purley. And I know through many of the discussions we had through the consultation period, people kept saying to me, this is Purley, it's not Hackney, it's not Islington. This is our experience. And I think I'm right in saying this.
Just pause there before you. So when you say that in all the schemes that you've done over recent years in London, you've been left with unsold parking spaces. So if someone wants to buy a flat in a scheme like this, would they have to purchase a parking space separately?
Yes, they would.
Yeah. So there's a cost that goes with that.
Correct. Yes.
So not only do you have to think to yourself, well, do I want my car? But if you then have to think about buying the car parking space as well.
That's correct.
And if I've understood this right, in all the modern schemes you've done over the last few years in London, all sorts of parts of London, you've been left with a number of spaces that people haven't wanted to buy.
That's correct.
Yeah. Even though the number of spaces has been fewer, far fewer?
Far fewer. I mean,
far fewer than the number
we did
of
a
flats.
scheme in Clarkwell where you had 14 spaces available for 185 apartments, and we ended up with 4. Now you do sell.
And you ended up with 4.
4 of them, so we only sold 10 with all of the apartments.
Right. So you had 4 left over, and in those with leftover spaces, I mean, what do you do? Try to find someone else to buy them?
We find somebody to buy them. Yes, somebody outside who wants to buy a car park space.
There you are. And then, as I understand it, there's not one of your schemes, but there is an example, is this right, an instance of a modern development, a recent development in Purley, where this phenomenon has been encountered in the real world. Can you just help us?
Yes, our understanding from our Frost, who are local estate agents who are advising us on the marketing and sales here, that they recently sold a scheme in Venture House, I believe I'm correct in saying, where there was 20 spaces for 20 apartments. All the apartments are now sold, and only 4 car park spaces sold from that development. So they now have 16 out of 20 spaces still remaining to sell separately.
Right, so 20, so that was a 1-to-1.
And that's in Purley, just to be clear.
And that's in Purley, a 1-to-1, and 20 flats sold, and only 4 people wanted to buy, only 4 flats bought parking spaces.
That's correct.
16 over. There you go. To what extent, in your experience, is this a generational thing? So if you're looking for, people trying to get onto the housing ownership ladder, unlike many of us who are lucky enough to have bought our home when homes were cheap and mortgages were really easy to achieve, what's your experience in the real world as to
Our experience is we deal in London primarily. A lot of our bar, we work across the board. We often say our best clients at the moment are the bank of mum and dad, because people come to assist their children to buy apartments in London, and none of them want to buy the car park. Most people we deal with have, the 2030. Mr. Phillips on BBC on Monday morning was talking about the government supporting 20 and 30-year-olds to get on the housing ladder. We sell to 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds indeed now, and most of it are not interested in cars. People are not driving. The younger generation, the 20-somethings, are not even doing driving tests and getting licenses. That's a matter of fact. So there is a huge sea change where people are reliant. There is this pushback against cars and the environment, and people are not wanting cars and are using public transport.
Thank you very much indeed. Good. Now, I think we've covered the main points that you'd intended to draw out. Take a moment, pause for breath, check your papers and so on, if there's anything that we've missed.
I think there was just one point I want to pick up with Mr. Nicholson on the affordable housing on the previous scheme. It was approved without any affordable housing. That's the point I want to be very clear on. The scheme that was referred to, the 2011 previous scheme.
Oh, the 2011 scheme.
It was approved without affordable housing. I don't know why that was the case, but the local authority at that time did approve it without affordable housing.
Jolly good, thank you very much.
But
well,
otherwise,
here we are in 2018, and we've got affordable housing, which I hope everyone will think is a good thing. Right, thank you for that. Sarah, I've mainly put Mr. Cunningham in to, I hope, help with some of the points that you've raised, and thank you again for the clarification as to why you've raised them. But obviously he's here. If there are any questions for him from the residents or associations or others, he's here to answer those questions. But most importantly, if I might say so, he's here to answer any questions of further clarification from you.
Thank you. Mr. King.
Good morning, Mr. Cunningham.
Good morning.
Just to let everybody know, Eldon Housing are a local small housing association that I'm aware of. I think they're very good. Amicus Horizon, I used to be a board member of that organisation, and they've now joined or gone into Optivo. Sadly, that's now an organisation with 28,000 units, and I feel that the initial spirit of housing associations is disappearing into these large development companies, but that's beside the point.
Exactly.
It's just a view of me who's always been involved in social housing. This, Mr. Cunningham, must have been a large part of your recent life, I think, dealing with this. This is one of the biggest package deals that I think I've ever heard of, where the client works at an early stage with a developer as opposed to designing a scheme and then going out for competitive tender. And I would always much have preferred to have done a package deal, because that is the ideal way of coming up with a good solution. So you must be a good contractor to have been chosen. You obviously do a lot of prestige buildings. We've already said that design elements of this scheme are excellent, and we're sure that you will help achieve that. I love this squash and squeeze, because it's obvious that the development has been driven by its viability, its cost viability, and you're hanging in there that suddenly the house prices aren't going to suddenly fall and you're not going to have a viable scheme. But I don't think that's going to happen. But in achieving your viability, you've been pushed to achieve this design. You said that you didn't anticipate, I think more or less, that you were going to end up with a 17-storey high scheme when you started. Is that correct?
we were following, as always, at an early stage of development, as you'll understand with your own experience. We have to start with what is the planning policy, the guidance, and the guidance on the site at an early stage was for a 14-storey tower at that time. It wasn't something that Thornside came along and said the first scheme isn't viable and therefore let's put a big tower on here and make it viable. We had to look at planning and make sure that we did. So as you'll understand, while one has to look, but we did look at every permutation of heights and mass, and the design was twofold. What came out of the testing, and I think Andrew Matthews said that very clearly the other day, the analysis with the design experts realised that the big fatter building up on Bansard Road didn't work, and the more elegant tower and this lower building actually looked better in architectural terms. So that was part of it. But we, as a developer, always strive to comply with planning policy, and that's what we had. We were on that road from a very early stage.
Yes, so the viability of it finally determined that we have a 17-storey block that's now been achieved. There could have been other solutions of not having such a higher block but having the smaller blocks higher, and it was decided by yourself and the church one that was going to be submitted for planning approval.
Thank you. I know that. What was your question, please?
No, it's just sort of confirming that point.
If you could stick to questions, that would be very helpful.
I don't think I've got any more to say that other than, well, the question is, would you agree that you finally reached the 17-storey as being the most viable form of development, or were there other options that you could have considered?
I think that the scheme that has evolved, as I mentioned earlier on, and has very definitely comes out in all of the detailed documentation. This scheme is an optimum scheme that had to take account of many, many issues all the way through over the 6 years, almost 6 years that I've now been working in this. And that was I have to comply with the planning policy. Number one, as you know, as an architect, we have to make it viable, because if it's not viable, it doesn't get off the ground. We had to manage the requirement of the church's needs and the community needs us here on the ground. We had to take on board all of the SIL and the costs and against this, the tax on development, however that manifests itself. We had to provide the affordable housing. So this, as I often say with a negotiation, if I may use another terminology, everybody's a little bit unhappy, but this is a scheme that we've worked really hard on for nearly 6 years. The church have been working on for many, many years before that. It has not got off the ground. Purley desperately needs to get a redevelopment here. I don't think anybody's in doubt of that. And I think the hard work that's put in by everybody, the council, the church, ourselves, the Housing Trust, Eldon Elizabeth, who I worked hard at many, many evenings to get to a point where we could make this scheme work. Everybody has come to a scheme here. Everybody's a little bit unhappy. We're all working on, as Christopher said earlier on smaller margins, on smaller space, less requirement. But we've got a good scheme. We've put our heart and soul in this. We're trying really hard to put the hard bark into Purley to get this off the ground. And at some point, you've got to say, this is really well considered. It's brilliant architect. It's excellent architecture, I think it's been said. It's a really good scheme for Purley. It's a really good scheme to promote housing and therefore the regeneration of the town centre. And I think at some point, we have to commit to this and let's get it going. And I don't think there's anybody that would put in. You were kind enough to say we've stuck with this for a very long time. Yes, we have. And this has grown from a relatively one-side scheme to a much bigger scheme, and we've worked with that. We've committed to the church, and indeed they've committed to us to stay with this. There's nobody who pulled together all of the landowners, all of the ingredients, all of the partners that are involved in the scheme in the way we've done, manage all the planning policy, manage the council, manage the mayor, both mayors of London, I hasten to add, manage the political aspirations on all sides here. I think we've done a really good job to get to this place. We're extraordinarily disappointed that it was called in. We're in this position. Mr. Nicholson, I know, will give us a fair hearing and go through the detail. But I think it's time that we look at this really well, say to ourselves, enough is enough, let's get in behind this. And this is what I would have liked to have said to Mr. Phillips yesterday. Let's get behind it and let's get Purley sorted out and not leave this mess sitting down the road that it has been for 20 years. I know I'm passionate about this. I'm passionate for all sorts of reasons, but it has got to be done. There's nobody that would have the patience and the experience of Thornside to deliver this. Any other major house builder would have long walked out the door and you'd be sitting with an empty site for many, many years to come.
Yes, but could you have a different design and not such a high block which is the...
Mr. King, I think I understand that point very well indeed. An alternative scheme isn't before me. So you need to keep your questions to any criticisms you have of the tower, not speculation of another scheme.
Thank you. Well, it's now a comment that the people of Purley are unhappy. And that's why we're all here today. Thank you.
Could I just ask a quick...
Yep.
I had the same question as Mr. King about other viability, but I won't answer that now. Could I ask what the position of the tenants will be? Will they actually own a freehold, or will they have a long leasehold, but will they also be subject to service charges and maintenance charges?
Are you talking about the affordable housing tenants or the private buyers?
Both.
In terms of the south side and the affordable housing element, it's split into two elements. There's social rented housing, which mainly Eldon are doing, and then there's shared ownership housing. But all of the people will have a 250-year lease by the time we're finished, because they get the lease from completion of the building work. They will then all have a service charge budget and will pay a contribution towards insurances, redecoration, repainting, cleaning, all of that. So it's a leasehold interest that the buyers will have.
Right, thank you for that. You said about your other developments and explained that people weren't taking up the car spaces because they have to purchase them. Our experience is in some other developments where they didn't have to purchase them at a particular, but they were kind of allocated on a first-come, served basis, that in fact all the car spaces went, and that's one of our problems. But the other developments you've said across London, now I know you mentioned one in Purley, but it wasn't your development. Have you done any other ones in and out of London that has had that effect?
Yes, in Battersea, that's probably too close. That's the most recent.
I regard Battersea as in London. I
use Purley as an example. You're quite right, we didn't develop it. I use that as an example of a development currently happening in Purley. Picking up on your point of paying for the car park spaces. Of course, that's all part of the viability test. If we don't charge for the car park spaces, we lose affordable housing.
Yeah. It may come back to a similar... Was there, in your looking at the issue, did you look at a smaller, if you like, auditorium and additional houses?
Again, we're straying off the proposal that's before me.
My last question to you is... Public transport use in London, and depending on where you are, and in this area, is actually gone down in the last 2 or 3 years, and the Mayor is struggling with that. And
I think that sort of assertion should have been put to Mrs. Balboa, frankly.
Well,
that sort of assertion.
Mr. Noble raised the point of more and more people are using public transport. I'm just saying, I appreciate that. Is a general perception, but actually the statistics show, and for Purley Station last year it went down 10%. Now,
I think you'll find Mr. Cunningham will say that he's not the right witness for this.
Yeah, okay, but I just make the point that, you know, and I would welcome more people using public transport, but there is a trend away from it at the moment and a trend towards more car use, particularly in outer London.
We'll have you welcoming fewer parking spaces in a moment as well. Yeah. But anyway, let's carry on.
Any other questions? I've just a few, and I'm not quite sure whether they're for you or Mr. Pearson or for the Section 106 discussion.
See how we go.
So I'll raise them now.
Sorry to interrupt, sir.
Oh, right. Well, it depends. Are you opposed to this scheme? And are you making a statement on Tuesday? What's your name? Yeah, I've got that. Thank you. Please make your question.
One question. Selling car parking spaces for this scheme, what sort of price would they be?
I think I'm looking to my colleague. I think 10 to 15,000 pounds per space. Yeah.
Was that it? Okay. I'll look to these. I won't call it profit, but the different viability studies and referred to in the latest one from BNP, they talk about residual land value, and they talk about, as you've mentioned, the need to clear the debt. There is, as you've referred to, the 2 residential units that would be part of the church. And I'm just wondering how those are taken into account in terms of viability, on whether they're properly taken into account in terms of the amount of money that's available for affordable housing, or whether there's a degree of double counting there.
I can answer that, I think. No, there isn't. I mean, there's a very clear viability test carried out by PMP Paribas on behalf of the council, an independent viability test. We have Doug Burt, who's our advisor, and puts together our appraisal on what's termed the 3-dragon approach, and then that is attested by PMP Paribas. They have inputs, and all of the costs go in. So the cost of building the church, as per our construction costs, when I say the church, I mean all the church and the community facilities, is a cost to the project.
Well, that is what the project is. So I'm not going to question that. But there do seem to be different assumptions being made by the applicants' viability assessments and the councils in terms of how the land values are worked out. The previous scheme was found not to be viable, so I question how a high land value could be given to a bit of land where you can't produce a viable scheme. And then as I say, there are the figures in terms of debts to be cleared and units that are being given to the church. And I'm just want to check and be led through how those relate to the viability and therefore the amount available for affordable housing.
Just pause. I can't talk to you at the moment, Mr. Cunningham.
He's taking instructions.
So certainly it's not a matter for this witness, because Mr. Cunningham isn't going to be on top of these.
Well, that's why I thought.
No, it's perfectly fair for you to raise it. I'm just thinking out aloud, almost literally, as to how we can help you with this, because obviously we want to help you, because the last thing I want is for you to write something in your report which, is based on a situation where we haven't had the chance to deal with this. So you've raised the point. And,
exactly.
Now, sir, the position is obviously, as is so often the case, when a viability appraisal is independently analysed by here BNP Paribas, you will find the consultant, Mr. Burt in this case, who's worked for the applicants, has drawn up his appraisal, has made various assumptions which the council's independent advisors take a different view on. The end conclusion, though, in both cases is exactly the same.
Yes.
As you know.
I just want to check that the assumptions behind them are the correct ones.
So I'm just trying to literally thinking out aloud. Obviously, if needs be, I'm not sure when it'd be available, but have Mr. Burt sort of help as to how he's gone about on behalf of the applicants looking at this. But given that the council's advisors take a different position on one or two of these points, then obviously, that's not for us, that's for the council. And I'm not sure whether us explaining how we've done it, and I don't know whether the council will be able to explain how they've done it, whether that's going to do the trick for you, if you like. So, or I'm not quite exactly sure what you're after. And I have to say that, again, putting my cards face up on the table, why are we thinking about unpicking this when it's been independently verified and the end conclusion of both assessments is exactly the same?
Well, I don't want to, it's difficult for me. I have a duty to test it, but I don't want to unpick it to the nth degree.
No.
But I do just on the question of land value, I'd like to be clear about what the land values are considered to be before and after, and how they're dealt with in the assessments, and check that the people doing those assessments understood those land values correctly and how they should be.
Well, I think thank you, sir. I think
does that help?
It does, thank you. And what I'm going to do then is I will commission our consultant to write a note on those exact points.
Right.
I don't know whether the council will be able to commission their consultant to write a note on exactly those points. Certainly from our position, we will have that note put in, and once you've read it, if that helps sufficiently, fine. If it doesn't, then obviously I'll see whether we can have Mr. Burt come along to give you all evidence.
I have just a couple more points. My reading of section 4 of that latest review, CD 1311.
This is the BMP paragraph.
The BMP, that's the one. It says that costs include fitting out, but I've been told twice now that the costs don't include fitting out, so there may be a discrepancy there.
Well, I think it might be who actually pays for those costs rather than...
Reverend Dr. Collins told me that the church would be paying for them, but the viability assessment seems to assume that that is a construction cost, in which case it makes it look less viable than it would otherwise be.
Well, they still have to be accounted for. Well, again, I'll ask for a note. They still have to be accounted for.
I want to be clear about that.
The fact that the church is bearing them doesn't mean that they're not a real thing that has to be accounted for. But
indeed,
they don't become free just because the church is paying them rather than
I understand that, but it's what's the correct way of doing a viability assessment, whether you do turn it upside down and shake it or whatever.
Indeed.
My final question, nothing to do with viability.
Thank heavens for that, sir.
I bet you are. Mr. Cunningham, my understanding is that you hope to retain the architects for the whole of the scheme, is that correct?
Proclamation for the island site, yes.
And there's something in is it the 106?
There's a clause in the 106.
Leans towards that, complicated clause. In the previous church examples and the ones that are on site at the moment, have you retained the architects throughout?
It's a combination of events. Sometimes it depends on what point we get in, but in principle, yes. But often what happens is we have not got involved at such an early stage, and the church already have an architect on board who may have got the planning. What happens in that case is we would put our architect to do the working drawings of the details, and the church's architect who did the planning would stay on board, monitoring the quality of the scheme, both in an architectural terms, planning terms, and indeed the quality of work for the charity that we're working with.
Have you been in a situation before where you were involved with the architect from the outset?
Yes, we have, yes.
And what happened there?
We retained them all the way through.
Which one was that?
That would be Let Road in Stratford, who they did this particular project. Proctor Matthews, who were working on this, did the scheme with the Worshippable Company of Carpenters that we worked with.
Is that one of your appendices, one of the examples?
Yes, I believe it is. Yes, it is. It's referred to. Because of the architecture, we wanted a consistency of using the same architect. Yeah.
Okay, well, that as well as the lengthy words in the 106, that would give some comfort that it's likely to happen. Yeah. Right, 1:05. Mr.
Good timing.
Mr. Katkowski, do you want to re-examine on any of that?
You know, on this occasion, I'd forgotten about myself, sir. So, no, I think Mr. Cunningham has more than sufficiently covered the point. So, thank you very much indeed, sir.
Then we'll adjourn until 2:05.
Thank you, sir. And I'll call Mr. Pearson after and then.